The land of China was once shrouded in mystery to the rest of the ancient world. The Silk Road was a connection between the two realms that suggested China to be of immense wealth and power. Whilst these distant civilizations would see dramatic falls, China would continue to rise through countless dynasties and emperors for thousands of years, forming the global superpower we know today, from constructing the longest structure in the world to hosting the largest and deadliest wars in mankind's history. China is the longest continuous civilization on Earth, dating back 5,000 years, withstanding the ancient era, the Middle Ages, and now the modern period. But can they continue on? To understand this fascinating land, we must start from the beginning. Dramatic music. The majority of China's earliest settlements began along the basin of the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze in the south. The people resided on floodplains and lived agricultural lifestyles, growing a plethora of millet and rice. The conditions were fair for farming, but a major issue plagued the newly blossoming communities. Flooding from the Yellow River constantly displaced or killed settlers, washing away their crops and lodgings in the process. The land was cruel and inhospitable, threatening their newfound way of life that was unto the legendary and likely mythological. Yu the engineer was tasked with controlling the flow of the rivers. Yu knew firsthand that the waterways had not been the settlers' biggest adversary for no reason. His father, Gwen, had already spearheaded past efforts to control the rivers, and a decade of his life had been spent on building his series of dikes and dams, which ultimately proved ineffective. No matter how large Gwen and his men built their walls, the river would prevail time and time again. Unfazed by his father's failures, Yu was more than determined to carry out the monumental task. He recruited the help of one Hao Yi, another semi-mythical agricultural genius, who is credited with supposedly introducing millet to humanity. The pair discussed schematics together and eventually built a canal-based irrigation system, which removed most of the excess flood water into the sea while saving some to be utilized for the growing of crops. Just like that, the system's debut had finally ended the era of flooding, and Yu the engineer was named China's ruler on account of his great success. Suspenseful music. Thus began the Xia dynasty, the catalyst for China's dynastic system. The dynasty and its lands were very prosperous under Yu. They remained a mainly agricultural society, but are credited with creating many great Chinese inventions such as stone tools used for farming and the lunar calendar. Eventually, Yu divided the territory into 9 provinces, and while each one was governed by their own lord, they were required to stay loyal to Yu's reign. Long after his years of stopping rivers and winning battles against neighboring tribes, old age and death closed in on Yu, which brought forth the question, what now? Yu decided that he did not want to pass that torch of leadership onto his son Qi. He instead wished for his Minister of Justice Gao Yao to take over. Unfortunately, Gao Yao died soon thereafter, and so a tribal leader named Yu was chosen to take on the role. The provincial lords disagreed with this decision. They had grown so fond of Yu the Great throughout his 45 years as emperor that they insisted upon his son Qi being his successor. Their wish was eventually granted. Qi was the first ruler of China to be granted power, not for his merit or capability, but because of his bloodline and connections. This hereditary system would last for thousands of years. It was in the 16th century BCE that the Xia dynasty finally met its fate. The last ruler of Yu the Great's bloodline, Jai, was said to be a cruel, sadistic leader who led a handful of military operations solely for revenge and personal gain, and filled his free time with sex slaves, drunken orgies, and senseless violence. Perhaps he was too blinded by his hedonism to sense what was brewing in the lands he now ruled. There was a concept in ancient China known as the mandate of heaven, a seemingly Shakespearean principle that not only states that heaven gives noble men the ruling power of China, but that any wicked, unjust leaders will be removed. Heaven had clearly taken issue with Jai. China had entered the Bronze Age, and much to Jai's dismay, A new rebellious power emerged with brand new bronze weapons. The Xia were promptly overthrown by this group, which would become known as the Shang dynasty. Suspenseful music. Not only did they emerge victorious against the corrupt King Jai and his men, but the Shang dynasty to this day have something that the Xia lack: a written history. Oracle bone inscriptions were an ancient form of Chinese writing, usually engraved on animal bones or turtle shells. There are over 3,000 documented characters from the era of the Shang dynasty, many of which are either still used or similar to modern Chinese characters. Considering the Shang dynasty was in power about 3,600 years ago, we know an impressive amount about daily life and key traditions because of archaeological finds such as the oracle bones. The Shang dynasty was quite mobile and oftentimes traveled to various islands and shores on their conquests. Upon each return, they would bring back seashells, which were used as currency within their society. They employed a feudal system that brought great wealth to nobility and subjugated peasants and farmers to difficult lives. The poor possessed little agency, but the military and government were far too powerful at the time for any peasant resistance to overthrow them. The Shang leaders were a highly religious people, with high priests having heaps of influence over the lands. These priests paid much attention to the death and dying process as well as subsequent burials, and established a handful of rituals to preserve their power and safety both on earth and in heaven. Common practices in the dynasty included sacrificing humans for good weather and fortune, as well as burying slaves alive with their masters to ensure their servitude in the afterlife. The Shang dynasty possessed a mighty military and workforce, conquering region after region and building major walled cities across the land as they went. It was a restless time with constant battles with various tribes as well as internal struggles, forcing the Shang to move their capital city 5 times. But their skill in molding bronze weapons and chariot wheels allowed them to squash opposing forces and remain in power for around 600 years. In a life that eerily resembled that of Xia ruler Jai, the last Shang emperor Daizin was overcome by temptations and began living a life of pure debauchery. He hosted massive orgies and inflicted cruel, sadistic torture onto those who opposed him. A handful of Daizin's family members were jailed for trying to intervene in his life of partying, and it is said that he had his own uncle's heart ripped out of his chest as punishment. It was in 1046 BCE, when the Zhou of the Wei Valley, vassals of the Shang, challenged the dynasty's reign at the Battle of Mu. The impoverished Chinese population was strongly in support of the Zhou, and many slaves, being forced to fight for the diminishing Shang dynasty, defected to fight for the Zhou. The members of the Shang army who remained loyal were eviscerated in a bloody battle that resulted in the deaths of around 50,000 Zhou soldiers and hundreds of thousands of the Shang army. After such a dismal effort, Daizin fled to his palace, surrounded himself with his treasures, and set the building on fire, killing himself. With such a decisive victory, the Zhou believed they had inherited the mandate of heaven, which would now become a major principle of Chinese politics. Suspenseful music. The Zhou dynasty was China's longest-lasting dynasty, spanning 789 years from 1046 BCE to 256 BCE. The events of those nearly 8 centuries were some of the most important happenings, not only in Chinese history but in the development of the world as we know it. It was a period distinctly marked by both invention and change. Large-scale irrigation systems transformed agriculture. A new network of canals was built to transport various goods across previously unfathomably long distances. Horseback riding became the standard for both travel and military use. News of silk production spread to Europe, and the Chinese moved past bronze in favor of mastering iron. Perhaps the most significant of these newfound transitions was that of bronze to iron. Europe and the Middle East were hundreds of years behind the Zhou, who could now cast iron using heat-resistant clay and furnaces and molds. They used the liquefied metal to mass-produce weapons and farming tools, propelling both the military and general society forward at an unprecedented rate. With such a rapidly growing empire, however, instability is sure to rear its head. The Zhou dynasty can be split up into two distinct periods, the first of which is the Western Zhou. During this time, the newfound dynasty was operating under the feudal system, a pyramid-shaped power structure where the power and land are concentrated in the royal family and are distributed to local lords as is seen fit. While this was functional for the Zhou for about 2 centuries, their control instability began to diminish. As the feudal lords grew increasingly powerful and self-serving, they began to revolt and raided the capital of Heijing, and in a move that echoed their previous rulers' constant capital movements, the Zhou fled to their new capital city, Luoyang. In everything but name and technicality, the vassal states had essentially taken control of the land and its governance. This transition marked the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period, now recognized as having begun in 771 BCE. This era yielded perhaps the most significant Chinese philosophies of all time in 3 schools of thought: Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism. Confucius, or Master Kong, was the most renowned ancient Chinese philosopher, and his school of thought aimed to create a society driven by respect, justice, and a widespread desire for peace. He was born as Kong Qiu in the Zhou state of Lu. His father Kong He was a commandant of the Lu's garrison, but died when Confucius was only 3 years old, leaving his mother to raise the boy alone in poverty. He committed his life to education and studied classic Chinese works at a school for commoners. Now educated in literature, history, and music, he was married at 19 and raised a family. Confucius's mother passed away just a short 4 years later around the age of 40. Confucius is said to have mourned her death for 3 years. He worked in a variety of low-ranking government jobs such as bookkeeping, tending to livestock, just to afford a dignified burial for his mother. As he grew older, Confucius had built a considerable reputation amongst the local ruling class. The state of Lu was ruled by 3 ducal families who appointed Confucius as the minister of criminal matters. Confucius believed that there was a natural goodness to humanity, and so the core of his philosophy was to restore an ethically decrepit China's moral code through social relationships. After hearing of the wars, orgies, live burials, and disembowelment practiced by past rulers, one can understand why he had grown increasingly discontent with the decay of Chinese society. He created a hierarchy of being to restore order and insisted upon each citizen understanding and adopting their respective role in this latter. This system is known as the 5 bonds and describes the following relationships needed to achieve social harmony: ruler to subject, husband to wife, father to son, elder brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. Confucius stressed the importance of respecting one's elders and accepting their subjugation as a necessary step to maintaining a civil society. Family is at the basis of the 5 bonds, and its effects are still seen in modern-day China. The tradition of filial piety means that parents are indebted to their children in terms of offering care, safety, and education, and children are indebted to their parents in terms of offering services, respect, and maintaining the family's honor through their actions. A family is to uphold their morals as a unit, and the benevolent family unit will subsequently expand to a greater Chinese society. As China to Confucius was in essence one massive family. His system called for the government to serve and take care of its people as parents would their children. While Confucius called for social harmony through widespread benevolence, another school of thought was developing in China that directly opposed his teachings: legalism. Unlike Confucianism, legalism states that people are inherently bad and require law and punishment to be kept in order. It was developed from the teachings of Han Feizi, a Confucian reformer who believed that an ordered society is a strict society, and a good citizen is one who allows themselves to be controlled. It gained traction rivaling Confucianism throughout the Zhou dynasty. The third major philosophy of the Zhou was Taoism, which stressed the need for humanity to reach a natural harmony with the universe. Humans are supposed to follow the universe's will and should avoid the tendency to go against its energy. The classic yin and yang symbol encapsulates the philosophy, as one must accept the natural balance in forces of the universe to achieve harmony. Unlike Confucianism and legalism, which called for different moral actions and behaviors from the Chinese population, Taoism embraced inaction, and a philosophy that can aptly be summarized as going with the flow. These three philosophies are all incredibly prevalent throughout Chinese history and the contemporary state, and are the most important contribution of the Zhou dynasty's reign. Because of the prominence of philosophical development in this time, the era and its products are recognized as the 100 Years of Thought. Suspenseful music at the same time as these developments, various states within the Zhou dynasty were beginning to declare their independence. Former dukes calling themselves kings and insisted they were politically on par with the Zhou king. This period is known as the Warring States, a time of unrest in which 7 former vassal states fought for the ultimate reign of China's lands. They were the Qin, Han, Yan, Wei, Chu, and Qi. It was at this time that famed general and strategist Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, the earliest documented work on military science and war. Though the book covered a wide range of military tactics and wartime philosophies, such as when to push your armies forward, and how to develop strategic flexibility in the face of a widely unpredictable war, it is no wonder why the art of war was birthed in this era. War had transformed in China. Battles became more sophisticated in the Warring States period, with generals using strategy and deceit to gain the upper hand. With increased troop numbers and conscriptions for males as young as 15 individual battles, also often dragged on for much longer than a handful of days like the clashes of before, with some stretching as long as months or years. The most powerful rising force of the country during this time was the Qin. They were led by Wang Zheng, or Qin Shi Huang, which literally translates to First Emperor of Qin. They resided in a dangerous region of China, where a powerful military was in need for survival, and thus adopted the use of various weapons technologies such as iron swords and crossbows. The first of the 7 kingdoms to collapse at the hands of the Qin was Han. They were the weakest of the bunch, and their territory rested right in the center of ancient China, leaving them vulnerable to attacks from all sides. Though the alliances and mutual interests of before protected them in the past, the Warring States period brought forth an every man for himself attitude. Wang Zheng and his men swiftly conquered the territory and forced King and of Han surrender within a year. Though there were far more worthy opponents in the near future, Wang Zheng's next target was the state of Zhao. It was not the first time the two sides had battled. Just a couple decades ago, they had fought in the Battle of Changping, which stands as one of the deadliest battles in human history. Records estimate 450,000 Zhao deaths and 250,000 deaths on the Qin side. Because of this decisive Qin victory, the Zhao stayed with still weakened when Wang Zheng marched his men past their borders to finish what had been started long ago. Despite their decaying state, the Zhao possessed something that the Qin did not: a general by the name of Li Mu. Li Mu had an impressive military reputation for his previous deceits of massive enemy armies and victories in numerous raids and battles. When it became clear that the Qin had their sights set on conquering the state of Zhao, his attention too shifted to the western borders to confront the newly ascended Wang Zheng. Any progress troops made were immediately trumped by Li Mu's tactics, and it became quite clear to Wang Zheng that so long as Li Mu was alive, little progress would be made. Failing on the battlefield, he targeted the general through tricky political means. He bribed figures of the Zhao courts and sent spies to create disorder within their governmental systems. His goal was to create distrust between Yaomiu, a king of Zhao, and General Li Mu. He eventually succeeded, and the king became convinced that Li Mu and his trusted associates were planning a violent rebellion. The general was relieved of his position and executed. Zhao was swiftly conquered after Li Mu's death. As his replacement, Zhao Kong was no match for the bloodthirsty Qin. The state's capital Handan was taken over in 228 BCE, and Wang Zheng saw to it that naive King Yaomu was too executed. Though there were some self-proclaimed kings and kingdoms of Zhao following this major loss, the state was no longer a true threat to the Qin. Any rebellion or descendant of a king that rose to power was squashed over the course of the next handful of years, until the region as a whole was completely annexed. After this success, Wang Zheng then directed his focus to the kingdom of Yan, well aware of the impending military force at his doorstep. The Crown Prince Dan aimed to defeat the Qin in another way by assassinating Wang Zheng himself. He picked an assassin named Jing Qi to kill Zheng in a suicide mission using a poisoned dagger of the sharpest possible quality. The plan was to approach the Qin court and pretend to be a traitorous nobleman, begging for mercy. He was to offer maps of Dukang, the fertile farmland region that Zheng wanted to claim first in his conquest, as well as the head of defective Qin general Huan Yi's head. Before sticking the blade deep into Wang Zheng, the dagger would be hidden along the side of the maps so Jing Qi could strike as soon as he got close. Huan Yi, the owner of the aforementioned head required for this plan to work, had fallen out of the Qin's good graces and was seeking revenge for their dismissal, causing the Qin to put a bounty of 1,000 gold pieces on his head. After Jing Qi explained the plan, the disgraced general agreed to commit suicide by cutting his own throat for the sake of collecting his head. So long as it would mean that Wang Zheng would die and the Qin would collapse, he cut his own throat without protest. With both the head and the maps now ready, Jing Qi and his supremely nervous associate Qin Wang traveled to present their gifts to Wang Zheng. Qin Wang was so anxious when they reached the palace that he entered a near-paralyzed state and was almost unable to move. Jing Qi excused his skittish behavior as nothing more than awe and cultural shock, as Qin Wang was, but a rural boy who had never truly seen the world. Despite Jing Qi's excuses, Qin Wang was not allowed to move up any further, and the assassin would now have to enter the court by his lonesome. Jing Qi calmly approached King Zheng with a map scroll and waited for it to be unrolled before grabbing the dagger and lunging towards him. King Zheng was startled by the sudden movement and was able to slip out of his grasp, turning away and running away from the attacker. Mayhem ensued in the palace, with the king narrowly surviving by continuously running in circles behind a pillar. The armed guards were all but stationed outside, and his ceremonial sword was too long to be pulled out quickly enough to defend himself against Jing Qi. So all he could do was hope that someone would intervene before the assassin closed in. Luckily for Wang Zheng, a royal physician stepped forward and hurled his medicine bag at Jing Qi, slowing him down just long enough for the king to unsheath his blade. He stabbed Jing Qi in the leg, prompting the injured assassin to throw his dagger in a last-gasp attempt to kill his target. He missed and was stabbed 8 more times by Wang Zheng. In his dying moments, the assassin taunted the king with obscene gestures until both he and the now fleeing Qin Wang were executed by the guards. The attempt had failed horribly and had only created an angrier, more obsessive Wang Zheng. He and his army invaded Yan in 226 BCE and quickly conquered the capital, Jicheng. In an effort to earn the king of Qin's forgiveness, a now desperate King Zai of Yan executed his own son, the Crown Prince Dan, as an apology for the assassination attempt. He sent the head of his boy to Wang Zheng, which postponed the complete annexation of Yan for a small handful of years, before the Qin returned to destroy them once and for all in 222 BCE. Wang Zheng began his attacks on the states of Wei and Chu at the same time, fearing that one state may take advantage of the fact that the Qin were solely focused on the other and catch the Qin armies off guard. 2 of Wang Zheng's most trusted generals, A father-son duo by the names of Wang Jian and Wang Bin launched simultaneous attacks on the two states in 225 BCE. While Wang Jian began the Qin conquest of the incredibly large and powerful Chu, his son Wang Bin led an army of 600,000 men to conquer 10 cities along the northern border of Wei, thereby guarding their flank. Wei crumbled fairly easily after Wang Bin cleverly redirected the waters of the Yellow River to flood the capital of Dalian. 100,000 people, many of which were civilians, were killed in the flooding. The king surrendered, allowing for all the Qin manpower to be focused on the powerful Chu. Their initial attacks on the Chu had not been particularly successful, with the Qin army being pushed back and repelled. Wang Jian was brought out of retirement 2 years after the initial seizures with an army 3 times larger than before, and the capital city was taken. The king was captured, and the state was annexed, leaving only one state to be captured, Qi. In 221 BCE, Wang Zheng's men faced very little pushback and conquered the kingdom within the same year. When the Qin arrived at the capital city, the king of Qi simply surrendered the land without a fight. The warring states had all been conquered, and thus began the Qin dynasty, ruled under the iron fist of Wang Zheng. Suspenseful music, though they displayed great promise and power in the warring states, leading Wang Zheng to proclaim that his dynasty would rule for 10,000 generations. The Qin's dynastic cycle was relatively short-lived, lasting approximately 15 years from 221 BCE to 206 BCE. Despite this, their effects proved to be very important and durable across the following centuries. The name China comes from Qin, in contrast with a feudalist Zhou whose decentralization ultimately led to the dynasty's downfall. The Qin enacted an intense centralization and subjugation of the state's citizens. Wang Zheng's main efforts included registering each citizen, with a government directing the flow of taxes to the state instead of feudal lords, and dividing the land into provinces, each one governed by an appointed official acting as an appendage of his ruling. He also aimed to standardize currencies, writing systems, and weights. While these changes were primarily for the sake of making the population more manageable and controllable, they contributed to the creation of a culturally homogeneous Chinese identity that was previously unseen throughout the country's history. China had become a united empire, and Wang Zheng, its first true emperor. The Qin were notorious for their cruelty and harsh punishments. As legalists, they believed people were born evil, and that the only way to sustain a civilized society was to utilize ghastly criminal punishments and deter potentially disobedient citizens solely through fear. Wang Zheng needed everyone in China to understand that he and he alone ruled the land. Governmental workers and military personnel were also subjected to collective punishments, to holding entire labor groups accountable for their work. If one man neglected his duties, it would come at the cost of the entire collective's well-being. Dramatic music, the life of a peasant under the Qin and in ancient China in general, was very taxing. Peasants worked long, straining hours, typically in one of 2 fields, farming or silk weaving. Entertainment was used to relieve the stress of long working days. Theater and dance were very popular, and formerly military training games such as Kuju, a game similar to hacky sack, were adopted to pass the time. The Qin state was a patriarchal society, and life could be very difficult for women. They primarily stayed home to tend to the children and look after the household, and had little to no say in marital issues, land acquisition or sales, or daily local proceedings. Peasants did not particularly like the emperor, detesting him for his cruel punishments and adoption of legalism. Pleasant music, it was not just his own population that Wang Zheng had to fear. Nomadic tribes, particularly the Xiongnu, who are believed to be the predecessors to the Huns, continuously terrorized the northern Qin borders. Armed horsemen would launch fierce intrusions on China's outskirts, highlighting the Qin's need for strengthened borders. This led to the most significant construction effort of the Qin dynasty, a Great Wall. This wasn't the same Great Wall of China we know today, though parts of the incredible architectural feat are still visible today. Sections of the Great Wall had already been built tracing back to the 5th century BCE. Though Qin Shi Huang was the first to think of uniting all of the existing pieces to form one Great Wall, peasants who were deemed lazy or unproductive in their farming or market jobs were oftentimes sent to work on the wall. Transporting materials was very difficult, so the wall was mainly built out of whatever resources were readily available in each particular area. In mountainous regions, the wall was made of mountain stones while rammed earth was used in the plains. Though the Qin did not view the wall as a permanent solution, the project would be continued over many successive centuries to form the Great Wall we know today. Though he had conquered the warring states at just the age of 38, survived 3 assassination attempts throughout the course of his rule and now fortified the state of Qin. There was one enemy Wang Zheng could not defeat: death itself. Calm music when Wang Zheng reached middle age. He became obsessed with his own mortality and sought out various elixirs and potions to extend his life. He sent alchemists and explorers on quests around the Pacific to find the legendary island of Pinglai, whose mountains supposedly held the elixir of immortality. Wang Zheng was so desperate that he could not understand he was being conned primarily by Su Fu, the leader of these expeditions. On the first voyage, Su Fu was sent with 3,000 virgin boys and girls and 60 boats, but of course returned empty-handed as the island was mythological. Possibly fearing the consequences of a failed mission, Su Fu and the explorers that returned from the voyage claimed that their passage was obstructed by a giant sea creature. Su Fu requested a troop of archers for their next effort to defeat the creature and move forward with their conquest. Wang Zheng obliged and once again provided everything he requested. Though Su Fu and his crews never returned from the trip, what exactly happened is still unknown today, though the most popular theory is that Su Fu simply sailed to Japan and colonized it. Growing increasingly paranoid and desperate, Wang Zheng began ingesting potions his own alchemists had created. It is at this time that a series of now-famed book burnings and live burials took place, as Wang Zheng had grown utterly mad. Wanting to erase all history and ideologies he saw as diminishing to his reign, and the Qin dynasty, Wang Zheng had 460 Confucian scholars buried alive and destroyed many of their texts and mass book burnings, which were the first documented book burnings in human history. Soon thereafter, in an ironic twist, Wang Zheng's quest for eternal life led to his death at the age of 49. The concoctions he was supplied with by his alchemist contained high levels of mercury, which killed the emperor by poisoning. Before the emperor's death, he had commanded the construction of a grand mausoleum to house his body. An underground acropolis flooded with artifacts, monuments, and thousands of clay warriors to follow Wang Zheng into the afterlife was accidentally uncovered by a group of farmers in 1974 AD. The scale and detail of each soldier shocked archaeologists. No 2 warriors had the same facial features, and just like a real army, they were divided by military rank in battle formation. Each one was equipped with a real weapon that had never been used in battle. There are clear signs of mass production simply to arm the terracotta warriors with new undamaged weapons. Wang Zheng had clearly decided that if he could not conquer death, he would conquer the afterlife. There is still plenty of mystery regarding the terracotta warriors. We don't know who exactly built the grand mausoleum, or why there is no documented history of its construction. It is estimated that it took over 700,000 workers to build. Because of this enigma and the grand scale of the findings, Wang Zheng's terracotta army is referred to as the 8th wonder of the world. Following the emperor's passing, his associate, Li Si kept his death a secret with the hopes of snatching power away from Wang Zheng's eldest son and successor, Fusu. Li Si sought to prevent him from gaining any more political might than he already had. As Fusu had ties with a general that rivaled Li Si in court, The pair would surely remove him from power if they were in control. Li Si brought the king's corpse back to the capital, and a merchant caravan of rotting fish to mask the scent of death. He then created a fake document supposedly written by Wang Zheng commanding both Fusu and the general to commit suicide. The plan worked, and with both of their targets dead, another son of the emperor took power. That son was Qin Shi, who quickly proved to be far less capable than his widely feared father. He was incredibly self-indulgent and childish. Killing, however, Li Si would not take power. Qin Shi would suspect him, and others of corruption and treason. Li Si was sentenced to execution by death of 1,000 cuts. This method of execution involved the condemned person being subjected to a series of cuts or slices to various parts of their body. The intent was not to cause immediate death, but to prolong the suffering of the condemned. Additionally, to top it off, his entire family to the third degree was executed. Quickly capitalizing on the weakened state, mass revolts began. Liu Bang, a peasant under the Qin dynasty, spearheaded a major uprising and gained control of the land after a fierce clash known as the Battle of Gaixia, in which over 100,000 men were either killed or taken prisoner. Thus began the incredibly successful Han dynasty. Suspenseful music with his victory, Liu Bang seized the title of emperor, changed his name to Geazu, and established the capital of the new state of Han in Chang'an. It is one of the only parts of the destroyed Qin state with a surviving palace, making for a fairly easy decision. Chang'an is where the Han's namesake comes from, and the period in which it served as the state capital is known as the Western Han, lasting from 206 BCE to 9 AD. Today, over 90% of Chinese people identify as ethnically Han, making up nearly 20% of the world. The Han were the world's most populous state and were contemporaries of the Roman Empire. After gaining power, Geazu cemented Chinese policies that would last for thousands of years. Coming from peasantry himself, he quickly sought to replace many of the rulings and precedencies saw to be unfair to the commoner. Taxes were heavily cut, especially in regions who were particularly affected by the wars. Many slaves were freed as well. Confucianism was brought back as the main philosophical school of thought and was taught in the state's new imperial academy. Family loyalty and virtue were once again the main pillars of Chinese society, not fear or punishment. Geazu also established the system of civil service to prevent lazy and unqualified men from serving in important political positions. The ruling class was based on merit and education rather than familial connections. This governmental system would last all the way until 1912 AD, nearly 2,000 years later. Although Geazu and his Han state had secured power, the empire was far from safe. The same nomadic Xiongnu who threatened the Qin were still a dangerous threat, and the loyalty of many Han generals was questionable at best. Following a series of humiliating defeats at the hands of the Xiongnu, Geazu made peace with the tribes and agreed to pay tribute. Wine and women were gifted to the Xiongnu on an annual basis to preserve the peace. Geazu died in 195 BCE, which started a power struggle to claim the throne. Though Hui, the second son of Geazu, became the next emperor, the true ruler of Han was Hui's mother, Geazu's empress consort, Empress Lu. She had murdered several of his sons to ensure her power following Geazu's death. Though her most famous killing was that of Geazu's favorite mistress, Lady Qi. Lady Qi also had children with Geazu, and Lu did not desire any competition. Sima Qin, a historian from the Han dynasty, wrote that Empress Lu cut off Lady Qi's hands and feet, plucked out her eyes, burned her ears, gave her a potion to drink, which made her mute, and had her thrown into the privy, calling her human swine. Emperor Hui was so disgusted and demoralized by his mother's murderous actions that he essentially handed over the ruling power to her. He lived a short life of drinking and sex until his death in 188 BCE at the age of 22. A handful of rulers gained and lost power over the following decades. maintaining a relatively solid sense of peace and prosperity, given the ongoing conflict with the Xiongnu. In 141 BCA, Emperor Wu became the leader of Han and would rule for 57 years up until 87 BCA. It was also at this time that relations with the Xiongnu had reached a boiling point, and full-fledged war began in 133 BCE. A handful of Han men were sent west during the war to seek out potential allies of the Xiongnu. Silk trade in China was being hindered by the tribes, and the Han sought alliances with Western peoples to fight the Xiongnu. What they brought back was knowledge about civilizations, trade, and the economies of the Western world, India, and the Middle East. A trade route called the Silk Road was established, which connected all the way from China to the Mediterranean Sea. The name Silk Road came from the Greek word for China, Seers, which translates to the land of silk. China would come to rely on the Silk Road for trade for more than 1,500 years. The Silk Road allowed for unprecedented cultural exchange, which led to the introduction of Buddhism in China. Though whether or not Emperor Wu was aware of the religion during his time is unknown today. The Han territory grew considerably at this time of war, as they won many major battles against the Xiongnu tribes. The dynasty expanded south into regions of modern-day Vietnam and Myanmar. Despite their victories, the Han treasury was depleted from all the resources poured into the conflict. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, while peasants were heavily taxed to fund the war, bringing forth a period of rebellion and instability. Calm music. In the year 9 AD, a rising politician by the name of Wang Mang capitalized on the shaky state of Han and established the very short-lived Xin dynasty. All of the empire's land was seized by Wang Mang and redistributed to the peasantry, which earned him the historical nickname of China's socialist emperor. Policies such as this were not received well by the wealthier citizens. The empire was left in shambles after a series of natural disasters, and a famine creating yet another period of instability and rebellion. Just like in the case of the preceding Western Han, the Xin dynasty also failed to extinguish the Xiongnu threat at the northern borders of China, leading to the treasury being depleted once again. The people of Xin had had enough. There were two major rebellion groups that gained prominence at this time: the Red Eyebrows and the Lulan. The name Red Eyebrows came to be as the rebels painted their eyebrows red to distinguish themselves from those who supported the government and ruling class. The imperial armies were defeated time and time again by the various rebel parties, and Wang Mang was killed in battle in 23 AD. Though the Red Eyebrows continuously defied odds and showed great promise, they collapsed after falling out of the public's favor because of their disorganization and lack of direction in restoring peace to China. They were viewed as a mob-like presence due to their brutal treatment of local populations and desecration of Han graves. The Red Eyebrows were trapped in a state of constant disarray and frequent deaths towards the tail end of their fighting years. The Red Eyebrows surrendered to Liu Xiu, one of 11 self-proclaimed emperors at the time who had been involved with a contemporary Lulan rebellion against Wang Mang. Liu Xiu, or Emperor Guangwu, was a very benevolent and pardoned the Red Eyebrows before beginning his conquest of the entire empire. Over the course of a decade, he squashed all of the other self-proclaimed emperors until he alone claimed the throne. Calm music. The city of Chang'an had been destroyed in the rebellions, so Guangwu established the new Han capital in Luoyang. This period is known as the Eastern Han, the latter half of the long-withstanding Han dynasty. Under Guangwu, taxes were lowered, and the emperor saw to it that the quality of life improved for the peasantry. Over 100 academic institutes were established using government funds to ensure a well-educated future ruling class. Guangwu continued to promote Confucianism and set up a system in which local governors would nominate young men who properly embodied Confucian virtues for governmental roles. With an excellent basis set under the dynasty's first emperor, the Eastern Han entered a new golden age over the 1st and 2nd centuries. The economy was thriving. Educational policies were as thorough as they'd ever been, and the military was incredibly powerful. Crossbows allowed the Han to kill their enemies from a safe distance, and durable iron axes and swords greatly improved their close-range combat abilities. Resistance in Vietnam and Korea were destroyed, and the Xiongnu tribes within the Han borders were defeated when they once again turned against the empire. The role of the emperor became much less respected at this time, as the civil servant class became the most dominant members of Chinese hierarchies. Paper was also invented at this time, allowing for their ideas to be shared much easier than in days past. Emperors were put in place and removed as the civil servants saw fit, but were usually more concerned with their lavish lifestyles than their duties at the helm of the empire anyway. This absence of centralized leadership led to worse policies that erased taxes and allowed for another famine in China. And so another powerful resistance group rose from the ashes. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, led by Taoist Zhang Ju, who claimed that the Han dynasty was already on its last legs. The rebels began attacking government offices and pillaging villages in 184. Though they ultimately failed to bring down the Han, the empire was indeed on its way out. In order to defeat the Yellow Turbans, the bureaucracy's forced hand gave significant amounts of power back to the nobility, who split up as individual warlords, each with their own controlled regions. Calm music, another period of warring states, began until the last emperor of Han was dethroned, and only 3 major kingdoms remained: Wei, Wu, and Shu Han. Shu Han, the least populated state, was the first to go. They surrendered the Wei after exhausting their powers fighting Wu. Despite their now massive chunk of territory, the Wei went next. They were taken over out of nowhere by a powerful clan called Jin, who then defeated Wu, the last of the 3 kingdoms, in 280. This meant that China was reunited and a new dynasty began. Emperor Wu of Jin was the first to rule the Jin dynasty and built a legacy of indulgence, waste, and sexual prowess. He quickly became far more focused on feasting and having sex in his harems than fulfilling any of his political duties. In 281, 5,000 women were brought from the palace of conquered Wu Emperor's son Zhao to his own in Luoyang. With all the beautiful women now at his disposal, Emperor Wu was overwhelmed with a choice and had difficulty deciding whom he should have sex with. His famous solution to this problem was to ride around in a goat-drawn cart. Wherever the goat stopped, Wu would get out and have sex with whichever woman was there. Some of the women began leaving bamboo leaves and salt outside their bedrooms, hoping to lure the goats into stopping at their rooms. Wu was utterly sex-crazed, using this goat-drawn method nearly every day for 8 years. He went so far as to criminalize new marriages, until he was finished picking his concubines to ensure he could sleep with any woman he desired. When Emperor Wu died in 290, the Jin dynasty got caught up in a civil war known as the War of the 8 Princes after his death. Numerous factions wanted to gain power, now that there was an opening, and started bringing in nomadic tribes such as the Xiongnu to assist them. This backfired, with the nomadic people turning on the Jin dynasty and claiming the north region of the empire. The Jin accordingly moved their capital south to Jiankang. What ensued was countless changes in ruling families in both the barbarian-run north as well as the Jin south. Both regions were incredibly unstable until the Sui dynasty was erected in 581 and unified the empire once again in 589. Gentle music. While the Sui dynasty was very short-lived, they acted as a very important turning point in Chinese history. They reinstated the rule of China's ethnic Han and began efforts to culturally assimilate the barbarians that had migrated into China. Confucianism and Buddhism were heavily fostered at this time, as the Emperor Wen of Sui had been raised and taught by a Buddhist nun. It was a difficult time to be in power. North of the Sui, in the Central Steppes, the Turks were rising to power and becoming a formidable force, which made expansion difficult for the dynasty. While the empire was relatively stable for a short period of time, it began to deteriorate very fast because of the evil Emperor Yang Guang's constant misuse of resources. Yang Guang was obsessed with construction projects and war. Many peasants worked to death rebuilding the Great Wall, and he sent millions of soldiers to die in his attempted conquest of Goguryeo, which is modern-day Korea. The last attack on Goguryeo had been an utterly pathetic failure, resulting in a 90% casualty rate for the Sui troops and a relatively tiny one for the Goguryeo. This all spurred more rebellions as the peasantry was fed up. A father and son duo became the two most important figures in China during this time of resistance. The father Li Yuan had been born in 566 in the Three Kingdoms period. Li Yuan had many familial connections to the throne with many family members close to the emperor, though that did not exactly make things easier for him. Emperor Yang Guang was evil, tyrannical and brutal, and offered little help to Li Yuan. His son, Li Shimin, was a very bold military leader who successfully fought against the Turks on multiple occasions. He famously tricked his opponents by bringing an excessive amount of flags and drums to the battlefield to make them retreat, thinking that the Sui army was much larger than it actually was. Though both Li Yuan and Li Shimin were initially loyal to the Sui dynasty throughout this time of war, it became increasingly clear to both of them that the empire was in decline. Li Yuan was very sacred and timid, and did not wish to turn on their leaders considering the number of family members that were close to the throne. If Yang Guang caught wind of rebellion, Li Yuan's family, including his daughter Pingyang, would surely be executed. Li Shimin, however, convinced him to join a band of rebels since death was already on his doorstep anyways. Yang Guang had begun killing his own generals who were not doing a good enough job of defeating the rebels, and Li Yuan was up next on the chopping block. With a little left to lose, it was now or never, or else it would be Li Yuan's head. He spread rumors that the emperor was planning another invasion of Goguryeo that would require even more soldiers. Still fiercely angry about the last invasions, the peasants hit a breaking point. They did not want to die fighting for a clearly inferior army in a war that would not benefit them. This allowed Li Yuan and Li Shimin to garner more support for their rebellion and recruit soldiers. After Li Yuan ensured the safety of his family members through replaying secret messages, encouraging them to get away from the capital. The campaign to take the capital of Chang'an began. There were many doubts about the future of the rebels, as there were many other rebel groups as well as the Turks in the north vying for power. Li Yuan was very weak-minded and afraid, though Li Shimin was successful once again in encouraging him to saddle up and fight the Turks and other rebel groups. The army grew significantly in size, and the Li family was reunited. Surprisingly, Pingyang had formed a rebellion group of her own, which was 70,000 strong. The capital was taken in a major attack with all their forces, and Li Yuan snatched power away from Emperor Yang Guang's grandson. The emperor himself was many miles away at this time in eastern China, but could not escape his long overdue fate. His own officials murdered him, and the Sui dynasty was without a doubt over. While the Sui rule was indeed very brief, ending in 618, father and son Li Yuan and Li Shimin had set the stage for a new golden age of Chinese history. Gentle music. The Tang dynasty is viewed as one of the best eras of Chinese history. The empire was stable. The population grew from 50 to 80 million people, and many scientific and cultural advancements ballooned during this time. The reign is viewed so favorably that all these years later, ethnic Chinese people refer to the neighborhoods in western metropolitan areas, commonly known as Chinatown, as Tang Ren Jai, which translates to the Tang People Street. However, such good fortune did not come easy early on. While Li Yuan and his family had defeated the Sui, there still remained a great many threats to his future reign. Two dynasties were established to the east of the Tang, and the Turks were still the major threat in the north. Capitalizing on all the chaos of war that comes with rising and falling dynasties, the Turks had been slowly creeping into mainland China. Li Yuan declared himself the Tang dynasty's first emperor, and Li Shimin was given the role of prime minister. The eldest of Li Yuan's sons, Li Jiancheng, who had helped in the rebellion as a key general, was named crown prince and the heir apparent. Even though he did not have the same glorious military reputation that Li Shimin did, this made Li Jiancheng feel uneasy and overshadowed in his role as crown prince. An intense rivalry began between the two brothers. Li Jiancheng and another brother, Li Yuanji, began preparing a private army to stage a coup and assassinate Li Shimin. Yuanji supported Li Jiancheng as he wanted to be crown prince. Once Li Jiancheng became emperor, unfortunately for the pair, word got out fairly quickly. Li Shimin received word from his soldiers, and Li Jiancheng's plan was foiled. He was put under house arrest by his father, prompting an associate of Li Jiancheng to formally rebel. Li Shimin was commanded to go out and kill the rebel leader, and was promised the title of crown prince upon his return to Chang'an. It didn't take much of an effort on Li Shimin's part to kill Li Jiancheng's associate. His own band of rebels killed him at the sight of the imperial army. Meanwhile, the weak-willed Li Yuan was caving in and easing up on his son back in the capital. Li Jiancheng was very close with his father's concubines, who would often do his bidding and try to rehabilitate his image. At Li Jiancheng's request, the women successfully convinced the emperor to go easy on his son, likely stressing the importance of family in such trying times. When Li Shimin returned, he was shocked to learn that Li Jiancheng would be keeping his title of crown prince. But there was little time to process his father's ridiculous leniency and the forgiveness of his young brother. The Turks had moved just outside of Chang'an. Li Shimin had taken charge and organized a treaty involving regular payments to the imposing forces just 2 years prior in 622 AD. Though the threat was becoming more and more dangerous as they pushed closer to the capital, Li Shimin approached the Khagan, the leader of the Turks outside of the city, and declared that if they had become dissatisfied with their previous agreement, then he and the Khagan should duel to the death. The Khagan was uncertain of what tricks Li Shimin had up his sleeve and withdrew his back to their camp. Li Shimin and his army remained incredibly close by, and after a night of rainfall, sent a message detailing the Tang army's advantageous position, as well as his analysis of how the Turks' bows would likely be deteriorated by now. The people of the Eurasian steppes used composite bows made of wood and animal horns, which did not fare well during rainy seasons. Outsmarted by the witty Li Shimin, the Khagan agreed once again to the Tang's proposed peace treaty and retreated without a drop of bloodshed on either side. Upon Li Shimin's return, it was all the more clear that he would be the next great leader of the Tang dynasty. This made Li Jiancheng all the more desperate to kill his brother and secure power. Li Jiancheng hosted a banquet in his residence for his brothers Li Shimin and Li Yuanji. He had poisoned Li Shimin's wine. Li Shimin was in such a horrible state that he needed to be carried home and barely survived the ordeal after vomiting blood all night. Li Yuan couldn't bear to witness the rivalry of his sons and informed Li Shimin that he would be dividing the empire into 2 halves to avoid further conflict. Li Shimin was promised the rule of the eastern half, which he protested, but it was no use. His stubborn father had already made up his mind that a vision failed to quell the rivalry. In the west, Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji continued plotting the murder of Li Shimin. In the east, Li Shimin was continuously encouraged by his cabinet to strike first and kill his brothers. Though despite everything, he was still hesitant to plot an attack on his own family. When the Turks attacked once again in the summer of 626, the 2 conniving brothers saw the disorder as a chance to kill Li Shimin once and for all. Backed by Li Jiancheng, Li Yuanji approached his father and asked to command the army against the invading Turks. Though the emperor was a bit hesitant, as he initially intended on sending the decorated Li Shimin to resist them, he agreed. Much to Li Jiancheng's delight, Li Yuanji was able to turn many of Li Shimon's associates against him while organizing his army. Those who had once sided with Li Shimon and encouraged him to attack his brothers had given up on trying to convince him and were now looking after their own lives instead. Because of this victory, the eldest brother promised Li Yuanji the title of crown prince once he became emperor, which would be any day now should their plan work. The pair decided that after they killed Li Shimon, they would finally gain power by forcing their father to give up the throne. Shortly after, however, Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji were summoned to their father's court. Li Shimon had submitted a message to his father claiming that both Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji had been sleeping with many of the emperor's concubines. When the two brothers conferred on what to do, Li Yuanji argued that they should fake illnesses and not go. But Li Jiancheng pulled rank and decided that they should both go to try and smooth out the situation to the best of their abilities. What ensued is what is now known as the Shen Wu Gate incident. Upon their arrival at the Shen Wu Gate, which served as an entrance to the palace city in Chang'an, they began to feel like something was wrong. They realized they were walking into a coup d'etat and immediately tried to retreat, but by then it was far too late. Li Shimon bounded through the gates on horseback and called them over, which prompted Li Yuanji to draw his bow, but he was far too slow compared to the quick Li Shimon. Li Shimon quickly drew his own weapon and fired an arrow straight into Li Jiancheng, killing him instantly. A chase ensued with Li Yuanji trying to escape the scene before Li Shimon could kill him too. In the chaos, however, Li Shimon's horse became overwhelmed, throwing the middle brother off its back. Li Yuanji pounced on this opportunity and tried to strangle the fallen Li Shimon to death with his own bowstring. Just in the nick of time, Yu Qijing, an associate of Li Shimon, arrived and shouted at Li Yuanji. Li Yuanji tried to flee on foot but was promptly killed by Yu Qi's arrows. Overwhelmed by the situation, Li Yuan agreed that power would be handed over to the surviving son, Li Shimon, and that the opposing forces should submit to his rule. The male heirs of both Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji were promptly executed to prevent further destabilization. The two power-hungry brothers had started a battle that they could not finish, and it ultimately came at the cost of their families' lives. Li Yuan retired to a more ceremonious role, while Li Shimon was declared emperor. Though there was little time to celebrate his new role, the Turks had not stopped their advances to allow the House of Li to play out their family dramas. They had already reached the edges of Chang'an. Li Shimon opted for a non-violent confrontation once again, as he thought that Kagan's selfish and cruel treatment of his inferiors would eventually break apart the Turkic Khaganate and provide an easier opportunity to attack sometime in the future. The Tang dynasty was too vulnerable to face them head-on right now, so Li Shimon simply renegotiated their peace treaty and agreed to pay tribute for the time being. In the meantime, the new emperor focused on building a basis of trust and free speech within his cabinet. He picked members based on their talent and intellect, and even allowed those who had served as advisors to his treacherous brothers to join his ranks if he thought it was what was best for the empire. Li Shimon encouraged his officials to speak honestly and critique his rule, and so together they worked on improving the domestic conditions of the empire before launching any attack on the Turks. China entered a very prosperous age with Li Shimon, now known as Emperor Taizong of Tang, at the helm of the empire. He is recognized today as the absolute greatest of the hundreds of emperors who came and went throughout Chinese history, and an argument could be made that China was the wealthiest and most powerful state in the world during this second golden age. But why exactly was that the case? Relations between the Turks and the Tang remained stable as Emperor Taizong worked on the living conditions of his subjects. But an opportunity to capitalize on the inner turmoil of the Khaganate rose quicker than the emperor thought it would. Political discord was caused by the Khagan's poor treatment of the tribes that fell under his command, and a handful of them broke away from him, which made the ruler furiously persecute them with all his might. War broke out between the various tribes, and in 628, a lesser Khagan by the name of Ashina-Shibobai requested Emperor Taizong's help in defeating the selfish ruler. He obliged, and they successfully defeated the Eastern Khaganate leader by the year 630. The members of the Turkic tribes that fought against the Khagan nominated Emperor Taizong to rule over them, marking him the first emperor to hold the title of both Chinese emperor and the Khan of heaven. Even after Taizong's death in the year 649, the Tang dynasty steadily expanded while becoming more and more cosmopolitan in the cities such as Chang'an. The capital was the world's most populated city at the time. With approximately 2 million inhabitants, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism all flourished under Tang rule. With monasteries and temples popping up all around the major cities, many famous paintings, poetry, and pottery were created as art became more of a staple of Chinese culture. Military efforts were made back into Korea and Vietnam, and the empire took control of many Western lands as well, which connected them more strongly to other major civilizations in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. They quickly swelled and became the most powerful state in Southeast Asia as a whole, precisely because of the emphasis on improving the domestic state as opposed to spending all of the empire's resources. When an empire is stable within it, it is far easier to expand outward. The Golden Age reached its peak early into the later Emperor Xuanzong reign, which began in 712, though the latter half of his time in power saw the decline of the Tang. In 736, historian, musician, and politician Li Linfu was named the Tang chief minister and began increasing his power as Emperor Xuanzong became less and less interested in fulfilling his role as emperor. Li Linfu had many of his court enemies executed and began introducing a series of policies that were very damaging to the empire. One major policy that would come back to bite the Tang was that the military governors must not be Chinese. The de facto ruler Li Linfu believed that there would be less trivial politics involved in the governmental process, and that none of his rivals would be able to take power. One of the generals selected was a Turk by the name of Lushan, who commanded an army with over 150,000 soldiers in the northeast. He was viewed very favorably by both the emperor and Li Linfu, and rose the ranks very quickly, even being named a prince. However, after Li Linfu's death in 753, and Lushan was steadily being edged out of his position by political rivals in China, recognizing that he had very little to lose, he launched a rebellion against the dynasty to try and claim power over the empire. What followed was known as the Lushan Rebellion, one of the deadliest wars in human history. In 755, Lushan attacked the eastern capital of Luoyang and declared himself to be the emperor of the new Yan dynasty after his victory. He then set his sights on the capture of the Tang dynasty's western capital of Chang'an. Despite their initial successes and rapidly growing army, and Lushan's next major battle, the siege of Yangqiu was a definitive victory for the Tang. The Yangqiu was very militarily important and was a big stepping stone for Lushan's push further south into China. The Tang recognized this, and 2,000 men were sent to besiege it, and killed 20,000 Yan troops in the process. The Yan men were now unable to advance because of the Tang troops' defensive positions along the Tang Pass, but the tides turned due to inner turmoil with the Tang dynasty, as well as completely inept military judgment. Orders were made for the Tang to attack Lushan's Yan army on open ground, and they suffered a very bitter defeat. The path to the capital of Chang'an was now clear for the Yan. Catching wind of the impending threat, Emperor Xuanzong decided to flee the capital and attempt to regroup in the province of Sichuan. However, this was not realized so easily. The emperor had brought much of his household court and bodyguards with him, and chaos ensued. His hunger induced anger and madness along the difficult terrains of China's mountainous regions, resulted in the executions of members of the convoy. Fearing a mutiny, The emperor was required to go along with the demands of his soldiers, even when they desired the deaths of his family members. While the emperor was forced to watch the strangulations of his relatives in desolate mountain ranges, a different kind of chaos was occurring in the capital of Chang'an. Thousands fled at the sight of the rebels who slashed their way through the city and looted like there was no tomorrow. Hundreds of thousands were killed in the bloody siege. In August, Emperor Xuanzang had finally reached Sichuan, where he abdicated and gave his son the throne. The new emperor recruited mercenaries to oppose Lushan, and they successfully prevented him from expanding further south. However, the internal turmoil of the self-proclaimed Yan dynasty helped the Tang more than anything else. Fearing his constant state of violent paranoia, Lushan was murdered by his own son, and Kingsu on January 29, 757. The ruler had grown increasingly cruel to his subjects and flogged them whenever he pleased, which caused his subordinates to turn on him, especially when the obese tyrant's health took a turn for the worse. It is said that a horse was once crushed under the unfathomable weight of Lushan. With his death, Kingsu took over as leader of the Yan and launched a lengthy siege on the city of Suiyang, resulting in one of the most disturbing battles in Chinese history. It could be said that both sides lost. On the Tang side, mass cannibalism ensued as the inhabitants of the besieged city resorted to eating the elderly women and children after running out of provisions. There remained only 400 Tang defenders of the city, less than 1% of its initial population. While the Yan did indeed eventually capture the city after approximately 8 months of battle, they had suffered over 100,000 casualties and wasted plenty of time and resources. The Tang were able to reclaim the capitals of Chang'an and Luoyang because of this disarray, and the Yan dynasty began to burst at the seams because of political turmoil. The rebellion was put down in 763, and the Tang emerged victorious. However, the imperial government was far weaker than they had been before this mess had begun, and the golden age of the Tang was undeniably over. 20% of the empire's population had died as a result of the Lushan rebellion, and the Tang never fully recovered from its effects. Over the course of the 9th century, the struggling dynasty lost much of its northern and western territory to Turks, and the Tibetan Empire who took advantage of their vulnerable state. The Tang were ruled by a line of poor emperors during this time. Massive groups of bandits became increasingly common, ransacking cities and smuggling illicit goods across the empire, until full-scale rebellions reared their heads once again. In 875, a disgruntled former salt smuggler named Huang Kao started a peasant rebellion with tens of thousands of soldiers and citizens. His forces steadily pushed into the south of China, massacring thousands of people along the way, particularly merchants who they saw as sympathetic to the Tang reign. By 881, the capital of Chang'an had been captured, and Huang Kao declared himself emperor of the Daqi dynasty. Angry with the selfish and inept rich and ruling class of China, many of his reforms were focused on confiscating their wealth. But it did not take long for Huang Kao to prove that he was no better at running an empire. Unfortunately, for the self-proclaimed empire, he was unable to arrange a food supply to the conquered capital. The Tang dynasty struck back with a series of counterattacks under the command of General Zhu Wen. Zhu Wen had been a general in none other than Huang Kao's rebellion, but defected to the Tang dynasty in 882. With the help of Zhu Wen's strong leadership, the government utilized alliances with a group of Turkish tribes to drive Huang Kao and his de facto dynasty out of the capital. Huang Kao was killed in 884, and his legacy today is one of controversy. Some see him as a violent traitor who committed many atrocities during his military campaign, though others see him as a hero of the peasant rebellion who was committed to ridding China of corruption and wealth hoarding. Whatever the true nature of Huang Kao may have been, the damage he inflicted on the already weakened Tang Empire was certainly irreparable. The central government had lost much of its power and no longer had a solidified army. Gentle music as a side note. While the 9th century was indeed disastrous for the Tang dynasty, an important invention that would shape modern history was created in 850 AD within the empire's borders: gunpowder. An unknown monk, an alchemist, was trying to invent a substance that would heal ailments and prolong one's lifespan. In doing so, he mixed the following proportions: 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. The result was plenty of scorched skin within the group of monks who were present, and the house they resided in was burnt to the ground. Gunpowder was considered one of the 4 great inventions of China, alongside paper making, printing, and the compass. Although the invention would be utilized more efficiently in coming years, particularly with the rise of the Song dynasty in the 10th century, history shows that it was Chinese monks under the Tang who discovered the substance. No matter what other dynasties or Western empires may claim. Dramatic music, without a widespread military application though, the newfound substance did not make a difference in the fate of the declining Tang. An era known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period was on its way, and would be marked by various warlords and regimes staking claims for power across China. The period is notoriously difficult to follow because of how messy and unstable the region was. With constant assassinations, new and shattered alliances and factions breaking apart, the situation was constantly changing, just like it had during the Warring States period. This name 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period came to be as 5 regimes successfully ruled over the northern region of China, while 10 independent states were established in southern and western China. Though these states were relatively stable during their existence, they were not as significant as the 5 major dynasties. The first of these 5 dynasty rulers was the warlord Zhu, when though he had helped the Huang Kao rebellion and then the Tang government, Zhu Wen was now looking to help himself. In 904, he executed the emperor of Tang and made the dead ruler's 13-year-old boy serve as a puppet emperor. Only 3 years later, in 907, he usurped the throne and named himself emperor of the Liang, the first of the 5 dynasties that ruled in this era. However, many other warlords did not accept his rule and established their own countries. One of these men was Li Qiang, a rival of Zhu Wen. Prior to the establishment of the Liang dynasty, Zhu Wen had attempted to assassinate Li Qiang, so he understandably had no interest in serving the new emperor. Li Qiang established the minor kingdom of Jin, which would play a large role in future power struggles, but rivals such as Li Qiang were not the only ones who hated the emperor. Zhu Wen often summoned his sons' wives to the palace to have sex with them. He was a notorious sexual predator who repeatedly assaulted his officers' wives as well as his own daughters-in-law. As a result of his horrendous conduct, as well as familial turmoil over which son would succeed, the crazed ruler, Zhu Wen, was murdered in his palace by his 3rd son, Zhu Yagui. Zhu Yagui would last just 1 year in power, being murdered soon thereafter by his younger brother, Zhu Yuzhen, in a coup for the throne. He would rule from 913 onward, with his reign lasting about a decade. It was during that time that a boiling point was reached between the Liang and the kingdoms of Jin. After many clashes with Emperor Zhu Yuzhen's troops over contested regions, the Jin kingdom had become quite powerful and contested the Liang dynasty. In 923, they established what is known as the later Tang dynasty. They kept the name as Tang because they desired a restored empire. Li Kongsu, who was Li Qiang's son, became the first emperor of the later Tang. While they showed flashes of brilliance and potential promise in unifying China, they failed to control the regions they initially conquered due to more declarations of independence within their territory. The state was thrown into chaos due to Li Kongsu's poor leadership, as the emperor and his consort Empress Liu hoarded wealth and did not reward his soldiers for their efforts in battle. In the spring of 926, he was finally murdered in a mutiny. The next dynasty was formed by a veteran general named Shi Jingtang. His claiming of the throne marked the third of the 5 dynasties and was labeled the later Jin or Shi Jin. During this time, Shi Jingtang's army was not powerful enough to control the incredibly dynamic wartime landscape of China, and in 936 he asked for the help of the Khitan in the north. The Khitan were a nomadic people who dominated much of Northeast Asia, including modern-day Mongolia, as well as chunks of China and Russia's Far East. A term of the agreement was that the 16 prefectures of Yayun, a region along the Great Wall, which contained the strategic positions of modern-day Beijing and Tianjin. The Khitan Emperor Yelu Dalang was also given superiority over Shi Jingtang. This was the cause of a conflict, as the later Jin eventually decided that they did not want to live under the rule of the Khitan emperor. They tried to distance themselves from Yelu Dalang's reign, which enraged the ruler who had so recently greatly helped in the establishment of their dynasty. A war broke out and Khitan conquered the later Jin. They sacked the Shang prefecture, modern-day Anyang, and massacred most of the population. The Khitan state was renamed the Liao dynasty, and Yelu Dalang declared himself emperor of all of China. However, this era did not last very long. The ruler was universally hated by the Chinese, and after constant pushback, he died while journeying in an attempt to return north. Shortly after this, rebel Liu Zhayan seized power and named himself emperor of the later Han dynasty. Though he died after just 1 year in power, he was succeeded by his son Liu Chengyu, who took the throne at just 17 years of age. Though a minister by the name of Guo Wei usurped the inept young leader after just 3 years as emperor. This made the later Han the shortest dynasty from this period, lasting just about 5 years. In 951, Guo Wei declared himself the new emperor of the last of the 5 dynasties, the later Zhou. The state served as a vassal state to the Khitan in the north, and lasted until 1960, when a new force emerged to unify China. The Song dynasty. The Song dynasty was formed after Zhao Quanjian, a military inspector, general of the later Zhao dynasty, gained control of the empire after a coup. He was able to conquer the remaining regions of China, not yet under his control, and ended the unstable 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period with the unification of the empire. The Song dynasty's history is divided into 2 major periods. The Northern Song lasting from 960 to 1127 AD, and the Southern Song lasting from 1127 to 1279. Zhao Quanjian, now known as Emperor Taizu of Song, spearheaded a project to map the entire empire and put an increased focus on scholarly pursuits. The civil service exams were revamped, and Confucianism made a major return. This revived push of Confucianism is often referred to as Neo-Confucianism in the context of the Song dynasty. Though the Song had reunified China, they were quite weak militarily compared to the preceding Tang dynasty. After Taizu's death, his successors had continuously been threatened by the Khitan Liao kingdom in the north that had been established during the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. Over time, the bureaucracy's quality worsened and worsened until the Jurchen, a northern ethnic group from the Khitan lands who had overthrown the Liao, finally took advantage. In 1126, the Jurchen, now taking the Chinese name of the Jin dynasty, conquered the capital city of Kaifeng. It was truly a shame for the Northern Song dynasty, as the capital city had become a beautiful cosmopolitan center before the invasion. The last Northern Song emperor had been an avid art collector and enthusiast, and so as a result, the city was full of gorgeous temples, palaces, and pagodas, which are tower-like architectural structures typically associated with Buddhism in Southeast Asia. The city was easy picking, however. For the Jin, the Song were very weak by the mid-12th century, and the invading forces burned the metropolis upon their arrival. The Southern Song dynasty began in 1127 with Linan, or modern-day Hangzhou, serving as the capital city. Despite their defeat in the north at the hands of the Jin, The Southern Song era was very prosperous. Rice production boomed as farmers were granted the rights to their land, which grew the economy as peasants could now sell and trade their surpluses to acquire other goods. The population exploded, and many great inventions came about. The printing press allowed for the mass production of paper money, making the Song the first government in the whole world to achieve this feat. The magnetic compass was also created at this time, which modernized navigation. Once again, the Song dynasty were also able to utilize gunpowder for weaponry and began launching bombs from catapults in warfare. This allowed the Southern Song troops to defeat the Jin dynasties and naval forces, even when they were wildly outnumbered by a massive number of ships. They were unfortunately still unable to take back the northern regions of China, as the opposing forces were growing stronger and stronger, and were able to replicate their inventions simply by kidnapping tradesmen from Southern Song and forcing them to recreate their weaponry and tools. Considering their outmatched military, the Southern Song scholars rejected foreign influences and desired the preservation of traditional Chinese culture, fearing that they could be wiped off the map during the wartime. This fear is why Confucianism made a comeback during the dynasty, as it was believed that the core principles were crucial to China's development and future. An increased focus was placed on healthy communities and families, which made for very well-developed cities. An excellent age of paintings and other art blossomed at this time, with many works focusing on the beauty of village scenes and familial peace. No philosophy or art, however, could save the Song from their fate at the hands of one of the most famous men in human history, Genghis Khan. Dramatic music Genghis, originally named Temujin, had been born in Mongolia in 1162 AD as a member of the Borjigin tribe and was a descendant of a former leader. It is said that Genghis was born grasping a blood clot in his fist, a sign in Mongol folklore that he was destined to lead. Life in Genghis region was not easy by any means, with constant warring between tribes and difficult environments earning at the title of the barbarian wilderness in China. Genghis spent his early years learning to hunt, travel, and ride horses, and was said to be very disinterested in speaking with others. At the age of 9, his parents arranged Genghis' marriage with a girl named Bort from a neighboring tribe who was 10 years old at the time. Such was commonplace with the Mongols, with camps often containing junior wives, concubines, and children. Women had a little to no agency in these decisions. Genghis was to be transferred to Bort's camp after the marriage was set in stone, so the pair could grow up together. On the journey, however, rival Tatars poisoned and killed Genghis' father by offering food and drink for their travels, leaving the young boy's family fatherless. Genghis returned home after this, as his family were abandoned by their tribe and had been left in a vulnerable outcast position. Without a patriarchal figure, tensions rose between Genghis and one of his stepbrothers, Bader, as both boys claimed to be their father's heir. Bader was the older of the two, though Genghis was the child of their father's chief wife. Their rivalry came to a head when Genghis was 13, and Bader tried to take a fish that Genghis had caught for himself. Genghis drew his bow and killed Bader, marking the first kill of a man who would eventually have the deaths of roughly 40 million people attributed to him. By the time the hardened Genghis was 15, he had become incredibly skilled in hunting and horsemanship. He became the leader of his remaining brothers, which prompted the clan that had initially expelled his family to take him as prisoner, as they feared he would organize an attack against them. He escaped during a feast and hid in the tent of a guard who had failed to raise the alarm as he made a run for it. He took shelter in the tent for 3 days, threatening to tell the clan that the guard had helped him escape. In a very clever move, he then used this cart to acquire a horse from the guard and gallop away into the night. At 16, Genghis returned to the encampment of Bort to finally marry the girl after their last arrangement had been foiled by his father's untimely death. Bort's father was over the moon at his return and gifted Genghis a sable cloak to welcome him back. Genghis then re-gifted the cloak to Togrul, the leader of a neighboring tribe, to gain his alliance. Wanting to regain the loyalty of the tribesmen who had abandoned his family, Genghis first aimed to build a strong following, and that he did. Other clans began making alliances with Genghis, and before long, he had amassed a relatively strong military force. Around this time, Genghis and his wife had their first child, a daughter named Khajan. Soon after, however, things took a turn for the worse for Genghis. A group of 300 Merkit horsemen, the Merkit being one of the 5 major tribal confederation of the land, raided Genghis' encampment and kidnapped his wife, Bort. Genghis swore to destroy the Merkit invaders, and in preparation was able to put together an army of thousands of warriors using his alliances. They struck back hard in a merciless attack on the Merkits, and comprehensively destroyed the invaders in a whirlwind of killing and pillaging. Genghis discovered his wife, who was now pregnant after being repeatedly abused by a Merkit, and returned her home to camp. She gave birth to their son Jache, who would be followed for the rest of his life with questions about his true biological father. Genghis and Bort would have 3 more sons and 4 more daughters in the course of the next decade. It was during this time that Genghis became exceedingly close with his childhood friend and blood brother Jamaka, and united their clans. The 2 men spent an enormous amount of their time together, be it during camping, riding, or other everyday activity. Supposedly, they even slept under the same blanket. Eventually, however, tensions arose and the 2 leaders left one another. It is not entirely clear why this occurred, though certain texts indicate that a jealous Bort played a hand by spreading rumors and misinformation about Jamaka. Unfortunately for Jamaka, many of his soldiers and leaders joined Genghis. Before long, Genghis was developing the largest and most powerful Mongol clan. He was acclaimed by his followers as the Khan of the Mongols. He proved to be a vicious military leader, and expanded his territory through murderous raids in which him and his men would pillage and burn settlements before taking their women. This served as a form of psychological warfare as well, with many men simply surrendering their camps without a fight to avoid the destruction that was becoming all too common in the surrounding areas. While they were overwhelmingly successful in these campaigns and were gaining much of the ground and men of Mongolia, tensions were rising with Jamaka's very much alive and very much resentful army. Genghis' former blood brother was quickly becoming his sworn enemy. Open conflict broke out in 1187, with the 2 sides clashing at the Battle of Dalin Baljut. Jamaka had assembled 30,000 soldiers and flanked Genghis' men from the north. While they were evenly matched in size, it was a decisive bloody victory for Jamaka and his men, and the disgruntled leader was shockingly cruel in the aftermath. He boiled 70 captured young men alive, and humiliated the deceased bodies of the rival leaders that were now siding with Genghis. This cruelty, however, did not serve Jamaka well, as many followers defected to Genghis. After witnessing his true vicious nature, approximately 10,000 of his men joined his rival side that day, which forced the now outnumbered Jamaka to move his men back. The victory, however, was still undoubtedly his. Humiliated with such a brutal defeat, Genghis Khan put an increased focus on the discipline and training of his military, and forged an unimaginably powerful killing machine even stronger than before. The Jin dynasty struggling with constant attacks from a common enemy, the Tatars of the steppes recruited the help of the newfound Mongol force, which worked incredibly well. Genghis' army crushed the enemy Tatars and returned to their homeland of Mongolia after their victory. However, upon their return, Jamaka forces looked to seize the opportunity and attack the unsuspecting army. The campaign was a complete failure for Jamaka, with his men being defeated after a series of 3 battles. While Jamaka was able to flee this conflict as well as successive efforts to capture him, he was eventually taken prisoner by Genghis after being betrayed by his own men. Taking pity on his childhood friend, Genghis offered him a chance to live and join his clan once again. Though Jamaka refused and asked to be put to death, some accounts state Jamaka was executed honorably, without spilling any blood, and that he was suffocated to death in a carpet by the Khan's men, while others claim he was violently dismembered. What do we know for certain, however, is that Genghis would face no more opposition from his blood brother turned mortal enemy. Genghis had now taken control over 1 million people and was the sole ruler of the steppe after promptly subjugating the remaining smaller forces of Mongolia. That was not nearly enough, however, for the famed ruler. He set his sights on the whole of China, declaring that he was destined to take the land. The north was still ruled by the Jin, while the south was still ruled by the Song, though the first step for the Mongols was to conquer the western Xia, which rested in the northwest of China, directly between the Jin and Song. It was a strategic location to begin the major conquest from, and was an important trade route that connected China to the west. In 1207, he launched his campaign and conquered the western Xia with a relative ease over the course of 2 years. The small dynasty had tried to enlist the help of the Jin dynasty while they were under attack, though the monarch Wanyan Yangji of Jin denied their request, stating that the warring of 2 of their rivals was very advantageous for the Jin. With yet another major victory, Genghis was now able to fully focus on the Jin dynasty. He attempted to send peace envoys over the wall to Jin, though the rightfully suspicious empire swiftly executed the assigned men. In 1211, an enraged Genghis and his cavalry men were able to breach the Great Wall of China and decimated the greatly outmatched encampments. A great number of towns were lost, and many Jin soldiers defected the Genghis army after witnessing his usual ruthlessness. By 1213, the Mongols had reached the capital of Jiangdu, which is modern-day Beijing, and utilized catapults and siege towers to take the city after a year of battle. They plundered the northern regions of the dynasty's land and continued taking great chunks of territory. However, in 1227, Genghis Khan died after struggling with the fever for a little over a week. The legacy Genghis Khan left on Earth is impossible to forget. Since his wartime tactics typically employed slaughtering every last person in a civilian population, it is estimated that he and his armies killed as many as 40 million people, more than Hitler and Stalin combined. At his time of death, he had fornicated with so many women along his campaigns that he fathered hundreds of children, with some estimates showing potentially 1 to 2,000. Today, 1 in 200 men are direct descendants of the terrifying sex-crazed leader. The Mongols, however, did not slip out of power once their fierce leader died. Genghis was succeeded by his third son, Ojdai Khan, and they kept pushing forward. In the 1230s, the southern Song joined forces with the Mongols to defeat the common enemy of the Jin dynasty, not realizing that this move would eventually lead to their own collapse. The Jin collapsed in 1234, and so began the Mongols' next campaign against the southern Song. The invasion of the Song is split up into 2 stages. The first stage lasted from 1235 to 1248 AD, though it was not as severe as one might expect, with the Mongols only gaining relatively small northern pieces of Song territory. It ended in something of a stalemate, with a ceasefire briefly halting the invasion. The second stage began in 1251 with the Khan election of Monk, a grandson of Genghis. He adopted a much more intense approach to the conquest of the southern Song and gained significant ground not only in China, but in Iraq and Syria as well. This stage lasted until 1259, and though they hadn't destroyed the southern Song Empire quite yet, the tides turned when Monk appointed his brother Kublai Khan. Recognizing geographic advantages that the southern Song held, Kublai Khan employed a series of innovative military strategies to adapt to southern China's difficult terrains. A significant achievement of the leader who would become Khan in 1264, after a power struggle, was the development of a powerful navy force that allowed the Mongols unprecedented navigation of China's many waterways. With the mix of both new and classic proven siege techniques established by his lineage, the Mongols were able to subdue the southern Song dynasty in 1279. Dramatic music, The Yuan dynasty was the new dominant empire, making Kublai Khan the first non-native to rule over China. As the result of a civil war, the Mongol Empire was by this point divided into four khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Hordes in the northeast, the Ilkhanate in the southeast in Persia or modern-day Iran, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Kublai Khan said his empire's capital is Khanbalik, which is now in Beijing, China's current capital city. Just like his insatiable predecessors, the new great leader set his sights on further expansion. Vietnam had slipped away from Chinese control with the decline of the Tang dynasty, and the Yuan aimed to take it back. They also desired islands that belonged to modern-day Indonesia as well as Japan and the East. They were largely unsuccessful, however. With many battles ending in disastrous defeats, they failed to take control of any of these regions. It was clear that the Mongols needed to establish a stronger governmental base, and so Kublai Khan established a caste system society with 4 tiers. Each ethnic group was ranked according to the dates in which they were defeated. The Mongols, of course, sat at the top of the list, while other Central Asian peoples were the second highest. Most of the empire's population belonged to the bottom 2 tiers, with the Northern Chinese ranked 3rd, and the recently defeated Southern Chinese at the very bottom. Each class was given different rights, with most of the real power residing at the top of the pyramid in the hands of the Mongols. Punishments for crime had varying levels of severity based on your ethnic class, and the ethnic Chinese were not allowed to own weapons, dogs or eagles, just in case they may try to revolt against the empire. Despite the incredibly high levels of ethnic discrimination, the empire entered an age of prosperity. Trade increased as the Silk Road was stabilized and heavily utilized. Cities bloomed and Buddhist leaders were employed as Khan favored the religion. Kublai Khan also restored the Grand Canal, a waterway network that spans 2,000 kilometers and links 5 incredibly important river basins of China, 2 being the storied Yangtze and Yellow rivers. The themed Venetian merchant Marco Polo lived in China for 17 years during the period, and wrote all of the incredible inventions and ways of life in the Yuan dynasty's China upon his return to Europe. What particularly fascinated him was the use of paper money, the use of coal as fuel, silk production, and the intriguing sexual practices of the citizens under Mongol rule. Like all other dynasties and golden ages of days past, however, the Mongol Empire did not last forever. Low tax revenues, corruption, inept leadership, and failed military campaigns all contributed to the downfall of the Yuan dynasty following the death of Kublai Khan in 1294. However, one of the most crippling factors was the plague epidemic of the 1330s. There is plenty of mystery surrounding the exact cause of the bubonic plague that would eventually ravage Europe, killing 1/3 of the continent in its wake. But what we do know is that it originated amongst Mongol soldiers in Crimea. China was the first country to suffer at the hands of the Black Plague after it was contracted by the soldiers, and spread rapidly over the course of a 4-year span from 1331 to 1334. 13 million died, and it spread to the rest of the modern world through the Silk Road trading route. By the time the second surge came to China in the 1350s, the death toll only continued to grow, though the exact figure is not known today. It was through all this time that a peasant rebellion called the Red Turbans began to gain traction in northern China, ignited by a series of epidemics, natural disasters, famines coinciding with all this hardship. The civilian-founded resistance opposed the rule of the invasive Mongols. The Red Turbans were very skilled in battle under the leadership of former Buddhist monk Zhu Yuanzhang, and were able to forcefully overthrow the Mongol Empire by 1368. Although the Yuan had not even lasted a century at the helm of China, their legacy was incredibly influential. China was far more open to the Western world. Trade had been improved, and the empire was unified once again with great territorial gains to boot. Even today, Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan remain as two of the most prominent figures of Chinese history despite their non-Chinese ethnicity. Gentle music. After the fleeing of the final Yuan emperor in 1368 AD, rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed himself emperor of the Ming dynasty, which would last until 1644 AD. Ming would become one of the most powerful empires in the world. As Zhu Yuanzhang, widely known as the Hongwu Emperor, consolidated his power and amassed a standing army of over 1 million men, a military much larger than any European contemporaries were boasting. When the new emperor came into power, he declared Nanjing the capital city, and a heavy emphasis was placed on the revival of traditional Han culture. Neo-Confucianism returned as the prominent school of thought, and the arts blossomed in this newfound time of prosperity for the ethnic Chinese. One of the most famous historical novels of all time, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which focused on the unstable later years of the Han dynasty, was written during this time. The Confucian civil service exam were brought back to ensure politicians earned their roles with merit and knowledge, and Mongol-related names and garments were banned across the empire. Public service projects flourished at this time as well. A former peasant who himself suffered through intense famines and natural disasters, the Hongwu Emperor established vast irrigation systems in dikes with the aim of helping to improve the lives and crop yields of farmers. As a result, the economy boomed, trade routes were restored and expanded further, and the population grew massively. Under Hongwu's command that 10% of military personnel should be gunners, the Ming dynasty heavily embraced the use of gunpowder and developed firearm prototypes and cannon batteries. This improvement allowed them to repel various invading forces such as the Mongol tribes in the north, and maintain their status as one of the world's most powerful forces. It truly was a time of great innovation and transformation under the emperor's rule. Though there was a dark side to the Hongwu emperor, he was incredibly paranoid about losing his grip on power, and enacted a strict legal code that introduced all kinds of brutal executions to Chinese law. These included lingchai, or the death by 1,000 cuts, where pieces of the body are slowly and gradually removed by a small knife, as well as fleeing, where the skin is continuously removed in a torturous fashion. Massacres were carried out on those who opposed the emperor to ensure no rebellions or coups could form, fearing not just insurrections from within, but the Mongols in the north as well. Hongwu desired stronger borders to protect the empire. This important sentiment would be passed on for generations. Under the Ming, particularly during the reign of the Hongzhi Emperor, who ruled from 1487 to 1505 AD, plenty of resources went towards building and maintaining the Great Wall. The construction under the Ming forms the most visible contemporary sections of the Great Wall today. The desire for strengthened borders was not the only trait passed on by the empire's first ruler, however. Throughout the generations of Ming rulers were similarly power-hungry and cruel. The last emperor of the dynasty, Chongzhen, assumed the throne at just 16 after his illiterate and possibly disabled brother, the Tianqi emperor, died in 1627. By the time he had taken office, the army was in a miserable state of disarray. The economy was in the gutter because of corruption, greed, and the self-preservation of emperors' powers, instead of a focus on building a greater nation. Enemies at every turn were destroying the empire, and new rebellions aimed to overthrow the Ming in a series of resistances, aptly named the late Ming peasant rebellions. The Ming dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. This era culminated in 1644 AD when the warlord Li Zicheng and his men marched on Beijing, prompting the Ming emperor to hang himself. Zicheng immediately named himself emperor, claiming that he had the mandate of heaven. Gentle music. He was not the only one looking to take the crumbling Ming's power, however. The Manchus of Northeast Asia, who had been steadily growing their power throughout the Ming dynasty and attacking the empire at every turn, immediately claimed the throne and began the Qing dynasty. This began China's second non-native dynasty, preceded only by the Mongol Empire. Under the reign of the Shunjie Emperor, all Chinese men were forced to adopt the Manchu Q hairstyle, where hair on the top of the scalp is grown long and braided, while the rest of the head is shaved bald. Cutting your hair differently was seen as a sign of rebellion, and the haircut would go on to become a cultural symbol of the Qing dynasty. It also ensured at this time that over half of all high-ranking government officials must be Manchu to preserve their people's power in the empire. After the Shunjie Emperor's death of smallpox in 1661, the 61-year reign of the Kangxi Emperor began, which would be the longest of any leader in Chinese history. Despite his leanings towards a Neo-Confucianism, the emperor embraced multiculturalism and the presence of various religious identities in China. He went so far as to allow Jesuit missionaries to spread their beliefs across the nation, propagating the spread of Roman Catholicism in China. The main feats of his rule, however, were his many grand public work projects. The Grand Canal was repaired to make the transportation of food far easier, and massive dredging projects protected farmers from the flooding of the Yangtze River. Prior to his death in 1722, Kangxi constantly worked day and night to stay updated on the happenings of the empire and plan further projects. Because of this, as well as many major successes, he's generally recognized as one of the most competent and committed rulers in Chinese history. In the 18th century, commerce and the arts continued to thrive and prosper under Kangxi's successive rulers. Yang Zheng, who ruled from 1722 to 1735, and Qianlong, who ruled from 1735 to 1796. Their success, however, would not be continued as we moved into the 1800s. Dramatic music. The 19th century was truly an age of adventure for the merchants and travelers of the West, financially burdened by their colonial failures in the Americas. Great Britain began searching for other avenues of resource extraction and financial gain. This led to an increased interest in China, who were now well known for their products such as silk, tea, and porcelain. The Chinese ruling class, however, was not so keen on the trade relationship desired by the British, very much aware of the destabilization that could occur by opening up their empire to great imperial powers for the sake of trade. The Qing dynasty restricted trade with foreigners and regulated internal transactions as they saw fit. They feared that an increased reliance on foreign trade would weaken the central authority, as the people of China could become as economically reliant on Western rulers as they were on their own. They also did not want the Chinese culture to be eroded for the sake of Western profits. Because of this, the Qing had previously established the Canton system, a set of rules and regulations to limit the economic influence of foreign merchants. Foreigners were only allowed to trade through the ports of Canton, and the regulations imposed on their trading were as follows. 1. The Qing dynasty restricted foreign trade during the winter months. 2. Foreigners visiting Canton were required to stay in designated areas, dubbed the foreign factories, and live under the supervision of a guild of Chinese merchants known as the Kohan. 3. Chinese citizens were barred from borrowing capital or seeking employment from foreign traders. 4. Chinese citizens were not allowed to seek out trading or market information from foreigners. 5. Foreign vessels arriving in Canton were required to anchor at Whampoa Roads, a designated anchorage area downstream from Canton, and were subject to inspection from Chinese authorities. European merchants could not stand these restrictions, as they inhibited their ability to trade freely and make profits after they had traveled all the way to China. The rules were seen as far too strict, and the result of this was a major spike in smuggling goods and piracy among foreigners. Despite this, the European desire for Chinese goods continued to increase. Tea alone accounted for 10% of the British government's revenue, and they were not going to back down from the potential goldmine of Chinese trade so easily. They needed leverage, and they found it in the highly addictive narcotic that is opium. The East India Company, A British trading company had previously conquered regions of India and grew poppies for opium on the land. The Chinese desired opium for a number of medical, social, and recreational reasons, making for a perfect trade-off between the East India Company and the Chinese. T for drugs. The issue is that the Qing dynasty recognized the health and social hazards of widespread opium use. Opium was illegal in China, as was the importation of it. A major uncontrolled importation by foreign powers was especially illegal. The traders were not concerned with this, however. They set up shop along the borders and smuggled in copious amounts of opium for trade. The number of opium addicts in the country boomed. The economy was drained of its silver, and the once impressive Chinese trade surplus was utterly destroyed. The Daeguang emperor was met with numerous proposals to legalize and tax the drug, all of which he rejected. It was clear he needed to act swiftly to prevent any further decay of the empire. In 1839, he sent Chinese viceroy and political philosopher Lin Zexu with the task of completely halting the trade of opium. Initially, Zexu wrote a letter to Queen Victoria stating that she had a moral responsibility to pull Britain out of the opium trade. Though the letter was never even read, Zexu was forced to resort to harsher punishments. By late January, he had organized a coastal defense in the province and begun arresting thousands of opium traders and users. By March, approximately 2.4 million pounds of opium were seized and set on fire as a public display of the government's determination to completely derail the trade and usage of opium in China. British merchants were bankrupted by the ordeal, and tensions between the British and Chinese continued to escalate. Charles Elliot, a British diplomat in China, was doing a poor job of mediation, and things only got worse after 2 British sailors murdered a Chinese villager and faced no repercussions from Elliot or the British government. They refused to hand the men over to the Chinese authorities for execution, which enraged Zexu. The viceroy cut off the food supplies to the British merchants, prompting the traders to retreat to Hong Kong. On trips to retrieve supplies from the Chinese ports for the merchants, a naval battle between British and Chinese ships erupted, marking the start of the First Opium War. The fighting continued, with the Chinese suffering continuous major losses at the hands of the Brits' vastly superior naval forces. In 1840, Lin Zexu was dismissed by the emperor because of his continued failures in stopping the conflict's escalation, and was replaced by the new acting viceroy, Kishan. Kishan was tasked with negotiating a peace treaty with the British and reached a tentative agreement with Elliot in 1841. It was titled the Convention of Chuanpi and stated that the Qing Empire would pay the British £6 million and hand over Hong Kong in order for the war to end. Both Elliot and Kishan were happy, but there was a major issue. Kishan had not asked for approval from the Qing imperial court and agreed to the terms without any input from his superiors. The emperor was furious and had Kishan arrested, while Elliot's superiors fired him from his role as they saw the deal to be insufficient. Many British soldiers and diplomats wanted the war to continue and did not want to let up so easily. After the British continued to push further and further into China, it became increasingly clear to the Chinese that they could resist no longer. Thousands of Chinese soldiers had been killed in battle over the course of the conflict, which was astoundingly high compared to the British casualty count, which was less than 100. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, which included the following significant rulings. 1. The Chinese government would pay £20 million to Britain. 2. The island of Hong Kong would be ceded to the British. 3. The Kohong would be dissolved. 4. 5 ports would be open for trade. 5. British citizens were subject to British law in China, not Chinese. This marked the first of several treaties that would be dubbed the unequal treaties by the Chinese, agreements that humiliated and exploited the empire. Dramatic music. In the aftermath, there was a major internal threat to the Qing dynasty brewing. The First Opium War had damaged the economy, and banditry and rebellion were on the rise. One rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, would mark one of the bloodiest conflicts in the history of the world, with somewhere between 20 to 30 million dying in the Civil War. But where exactly did the Taiping Rebellion come from? Years ago in 1814, a boy named Hong Xiuquan was born in the Huadu district of Guangzhou. Hong was said to be incredibly intelligent and dreamed of academia from a young age. However, the imperial examinations required to earn spots in academies and high-paying government jobs were incredibly difficult and competitive. Millions of applicants would take the tests, and while Hong did exceedingly well on preliminary tests, he was unable to seize a position after his first attempt on the exams. He returned to his small village to become a school teacher and save up some money. Though he remained transfixed on his dreams of academia and governmental work, he continued to sink his money into returns to the city of Guangzhou for the purpose of writing the exams. Though after his third failure, Hong was driven into a mental breakdown. His family believed he would die as Hong was completely delirious. At this time, Hong dreamed of heaven and discovered a heavenly family. Hong's heavenly father donned a long golden beard and black dragon robe, which were worn by the emperors of China. He complained that the men under his reign were worshipping demons instead of himself, and gave Hong a sword to fight against the demons destroying the heavenly realm. Hong and his heavenly brother led a spiritual army that vanquished the demons and saved heaven. Hong also reported seeing Confucius being punished by the Heavenly Father for leading the Chinese people astray. The dream stuck with Hong, who reportedly became far more careful, friendly, and open. After teaching for several more years, Hong decided he would take the imperial examinations and met the same fate he had the first 3 times. After this final failure, a cousin of Hong suggested that he re-examine a Christian pamphlet that he had been given by a missionary after filling the exams years ago for the second time when he was 22. After reading the material, Hong decided that Christianity was directly connected with the fever dreams he had suffered in his state of delirium during his mental breakdown. The Heavenly Father must have been God, and the brother he fought alongside with the spiritual army must have been Jesus Christ. Hong believed that he was the literal son of God and a brother of Jesus. He destroyed all the Buddhist and Confucianist imagery in his home and began vehemently preaching Christianity. He was eventually banned from teaching in his own village after toppling various religious and philosophical monuments and idols that he did not believe aligned with his Christian faith. In 1844, Hong and a handful of relatives, schoolmates and followers left the country to preach the religious doctrine across China. After the group steadily grew, Hong became the leader of a religious movement called the God-worshipping Society, which attracted thousands of converts. Many peasant followers adored the anti-government rhetoric preached by the society, as Hong believed that the demon-infested Qing dynasty needed to be destroyed. Hong had created his own adaptation of the Bible called the Authorized Taiping Version of the Bible, and explained that the religion had existed long ago, but was wiped out by the evil Confucius and the imperial system. By 1850, Hong had tens of thousands of followers with modern size estimates ranging all the way to 30,000 members. The Qing dynasty feared the steadily growing cult and decided to take action against it. In the province of Guangxi, many peasants who had suffered through famine and economic struggles were drawn to Hong's movement, but were ordered not to join by imperial troops. Any new converts were to be executed. By January 1851, the God-worshipping society quickly militarized and battled against 7,000 Qing soldiers. It is said that the command of the cult was shockingly organized compared to prior rebellions, and after the bloodshed of over 1,000 men, Hong's soldiers emerged victorious. Hong then declared the founding of the Heavenly Kingdom of Transcendent Peace, his movement that would hopefully topple the Qing dynasty. The movement marched from city to recruit members, and it grew at an unprecedented rate. Both men and women in many major settlements were prepared to die for the cause. In March of the year 1853, one of Hong's forces, which consisted of over 500,000 soldiers, launched a siege on the city of Nanjing, which was defended by somewhere between 40,000 to 80,000 Qing soldiers. After 13 days of a ruthless battle, including major bombings, spy missions, and major violent charges, Hong soldiers, or the Taiping Rebellion, took the city and declared it as their capital city. The movement's ruling was divided between kings who all claimed they could communicate with God himself. The most notable of these was Yang Ziyuking, who served as king of the East. He served as Hong's right-hand man and implemented reforms such as the outlawing of opium and the social equalization of both men and women. The two genders were separated, that is, outside of Hong's harem. European travelers observing the new Christian kingdom in South China, much of which was now under Taiping control, were astounded by how rigid the rules of the land were. Sex, drinking, gambling, tobacco, prostitution, and dancing were all outlawed, and disobeying these rules resulted in the death penalty. Despite the distrust between the Qing dynasty and Western powers as a result of the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion was not supported by Europe. Hong had reached out to the Western powers for assistance since they now shared a religion. The United States viewed Hong and the rebellion quite favorably and prepared to recognize their independence from the Qing. Though nothing solidified, Britain, France, and the Americans eventually supported the Qing for a handful of reasons, and came to see the Taiping Rebellion as a diametrically oppositional force rather than brothers in Christ. The British wanted their payments that were outlawed and the treaty signed during the Opium Wars, which the Taiping Peasant Rebellion obviously would not be paying. Furthermore, Hong's claims of being directly related to God and Jesus were seen as disrespectful by many Europeans, and they distrusted the leader's agenda given how much violence and death occurred with each move of the Taiping. A particularly disturbing example of this violence occurred in 1856 in an event called the Tianjin Incident. Yang Ziyuking overstepped his political bounds when he began claiming that he was the true vessel for God's word. He had been gaining traction as a leader in his own right and wanted to seize power over the kingdom, and had amassed thousands of followers himself. He continuously pretended to be possessed by the Heavenly Father and accused Hong of being an impostor. Considering such rhetoric to be treasonous, Hong did not take kindly to Yang's actions and dispatched the King of the West, as well as a handful of generals, to exterminate the King of the East, as well as all of his followers and relatives. They stormed Yang's palace and killed him, then slaughtered all of his family members before moving on to his followers. Many were tricked into entering the palace and were systematically executed. Over the course of 3 months, Hong's men would kill 27,000 civilians in the mass executions. The cult was becoming increasingly more dangerous under Hong's tyrannical rule, and reports of indiscriminate slaughterings of civilians with each new land they took became more and more common. However, the Qing dynasty's attention needed to be divided between the Taiping Rebellion and the Western European powers. A second Opium War was on the way. Calm music despite the overwhelming victory of the First Opium War, Western powers such as the British government, France, and the United States were still not satisfied with their earnings in China. They wanted opium to be wholly legalized in China, and were not content with the results of the Treaty of Nanjing and other treaties signed in later years. The British were looking for an excuse to extend their trading rights and reinvade China, and in October of 1856, the opportunity came. The Chinese crew of a British-registered ship called the Arrow were arrested by the Chinese officials in Canton on suspicion of being pirates. The captain of the ship, a Brit by the name of Thomas Kennedy, was aboard a nearby ship at the time and reported that he saw the British flag being lowered by the Chinese Marines during the ordeal. Furious British diplomats demanded that an apology be issued immediately and that the 12 arrested crew members be released. Much to their surprise, the new Viceroy Yi Mingchen only released 9 of the 12, refusing to let the other 3 go. Within the month, a bombardment of Canton by the British began, with a powerful army firing a shot at the poorly protected city. In their efforts to fight back, the Chinese attacked American ships, which drew yet another powerful nation in on the fight against the Qing. Yi Mingchen offered a bounty for every British had taken, but it was of little use. After blasting holes in the flimsy city walls, skirmishes broke out between the Western and Chinese troops. As the attackers entered Canton, the American flag was planted on the residence of Yi Mingchen by the U.S. consul as a symbol of their dominance. After negotiations to cease fighting failed, the British struck even harder, with over 20 Chinese ships being destroyed in November. Though the United States and Russia were both disinterested in formal alliances with the British against the Chinese, the French joined their fight against China in late 1857. Their official excuse for joining, or casus belli, was the Chinese execution of a French missionary, Auguste Chapdelaine, who was accused of plotting insurrection in a region foreigners were not supposed to be in. He refused to pay a bribe to the arresting officials, and as a result was sentenced to death. The missionary had been beaten 100 times on the cheek, causing his teeth to be knocked out. His jaw was completely lacerated by this, and his face was destroyed. He was then placed in a tiny iron cage which hung at the gate of the jail. His death was by suffocation. As the Chinese removed the wooden plank he stood on one by one, which strained the muscles of his neck until he died. Chinese children hurled stones at Chapdelaine's decapitated head until it toppled to the ground and was eaten by stray dogs. On January 1st, 1858, the combined British and French forces cruised the Victory after a joint attack on Canton and captured Yi Mingchen as their prisoner. The Western power suffered only 15 casualties, while somewhere between 200 to 650 of the hemmed-in militarily inferior Chinese were killed in action. Viceroy Yi Mingchen was exiled to India, where he starved himself to death. Utterly humiliated, the Chinese were forced to negotiate once again. An alliance was formed at this time between Great Britain, France, the United States, and Russia. So each respective global power benefited greatly from their New Deal, the Treaty of Tianjin. The new treaty stated that 1. All 4 countries had the right to establish embassies in Beijing, which was close to foreigners at the time. 2. More Chinese ports would be opened for foreign trade. 3. Free travel would be established along the Yangtze River for all foreign ships. 4. Free travel in mainland China would be established as a right for foreigners. 5. China would pay millions of taels of silver to both Britain and France. Shortly after this disastrous treaty for the Chinese was agreed to, ministers urged the Xianfeng emperor to resist against the Western powers once again. The emperor decided he was going to deny the 4 countries' ability to set up foreign litigations in Beijing, and the alliance caught wind of this. Once again, the war was on. 3 battles were fought at the Taku forts. The battles were fought there as the forts were in a strategic position that allowed access to Beijing. After split losses and hundreds of deaths scattered amongst both sides, the Western forces eventually emerged victorious once again. They pushed into Beijing with the British troops burning down the Xianfeng emperor's summer palace when they arrived at the city. The old palace is said to have burnt for 3 days and 3 nights. The Qing army was rendered useless by this point, so the emperor fled the capital, leaving his brother Prince Gong behind to negotiate peace with Britain and France. A new treaty was reached in 1860, which, amongst other concessions, such as major payments to the Western powers and freedom of religion for Christians, contained the final blow for the Chinese Empire: the legalization of opium. The massive defeats in the 2 successive opium wars marked the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty. The era is known today as the Century of Humiliation. The days of being cut off from the Western world were long gone, and a stretch of great instability was about to begin. Dramatic music. All this time, Han and the Taiping Rebellion had not yet subsided. More cities had been taken over the course of the Second Opium War, while the Qing were thinly stretched, fighting against vastly superior powers. It was around this time that the Qing rulers sided with regional warlords or the new armies that opposed the expanding Taiping kingdom. Western countries also began to oppose the Taiping as the cult had begun attacking regions with important trading ports for foreigners. The Brits and Americans supplied the struggling Qing with weaponry and training, and thus a fresh and prepared Qing army was able to launch a major offensive against the Taiping. The Qing adopted the vicious and savage military techniques of the Taiping rebellion, burning entire towns to the ground and executing civilians en masse. Famine and plagues began as each side destroyed an unfathomable amount of crops and settlements. Hundreds of cities were entirely destroyed, their citizens murdered. Some Taiping citizens and besieged cities resorted to cannibalism and selling human flesh because the famines were so bad. The Taiping were pushed further and further back, losing much of their land in southern China until only the capital of Nanjing remained. The Qing had the Taiping kingdom completely surrounded, and many began to starve within the city limits as the Qing forces ruined the supply lines. It was simply a matter of time before they were completely defeated. So Hong's officials urged him to evacuate the city to regroup and establish a new plan to fight against the renewed Qing forces. However, Hong truly believed the Taiping had got on their side, and that they could not be defeated so long as they were his chosen people. After the city continued to deteriorate multiple push-pull battles with his increasingly desperate advisors, finally convinced Hong to leave the palace. Hong addressed his followers and stated that they would survive off of manna that God would send from heaven. Manna was an edible substance in the Bible that God provided for the Israelites during their travels in the desert, and Hong believed the divinity would offer the same substance and abundance for him and his followers. They began ingesting weeds, believing them to be manna, resulting in Hong's death of food poisoning in June of 1864. The Qing army finally marched into the city of Nanjing and killed all the remaining Taiping leaders. Though they were not finished there, many of Hong's followers were executed in house-by-house massacres at the hands of the Qing, while thousands of others resorted to burning themselves in mass suicides. On July 30th of the same year, the Qing forces located Hong Ziyuquan's body and removed it from its burial place, wanting to punish the crazed leader for eternity and ensure that his body would never have a final resting place. They cut off his head and cremated the remains. Hong's ashes were then blasted out of a cannon so that they would be dispersed without any organization. After tens of millions of deaths, most of which were due to plague and famine, the war had been definitively won by the Qing dynasty, and they believed once again that they could hold onto their power in China. This belief, however, was misguiding. Gentle music, corruption ran rampant in the unstable years following the Opium Wars, and the Qing dynasty lacked strong central leadership. To the east of China grew an increasingly modernized Japan, who was grappling with the effects of Western intrusions far better than the Qing. Under Emperor Meiji, Japan was expanding their territory with a rapidly strengthening military, and set their sights on Korea, even though the nation had been under China's grasp for centuries. In 1875, Korea was forced to sign a treaty that opened up their ports to foreigners with a heavy focus on Japanese trade. This effectively depleted the Chinese of their power in the region, as the Koreans were forced to declare their foreign relations as independent from the Qing. Both the Qing and the Japanese stationed troops in Korea, though there was no direct conflict. Both sides' forces were momentarily pulled after a series of treaties. The peace, however, did not last for very long. Tensions continued to rise over the next 2 decades, with troops moving about, until the two empires reached a boiling point in 1894. A series of coups and assassinations in Korea broke the convention that initially held the peace. And on August 1st, war was officially declared between the Qing Empire and the Empire of Japan. Though the Chinese had 4 times as many troops as the Japanese, they were not as well prepared. Once again, the Japanese Empire had done a much better job of modernizing, and their troops were far more capable. The Chinese had, by this point, purchased plenty of modern military equipment. Though they were poorly trained and disorganized, the Japanese pushed the Chinese back time and time again in a series of devastating losses for the Qing troops. The Navy, nor the foot soldiers were any match for the Japanese. By the early spring of 1895, the Japanese had successfully invaded both Manchuria as well as the province of Shandong. The Chinese were defeated, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed on April 17th. It stated that China must cede Taiwan, recognize the independence of Korea, and pay a massive sum of taels to Japan. Just like that, the Qing dynasty had suffered yet another major defeat that tacked onto the century of humiliation. In the aftermath of the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the First Sino-Japanese War, and lastly, the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, a violent anti-foreigner movement run by a secret society, the Qing dynasty was in a complete state of disarray. Other rebellions broke out across the empire, as many people had lost faith in the Qing dynasty's ability to maintain China's power in a rapidly industrializing modern world. In 1910, there were 285 rebellions in the calendar year alone. However, most were spearheaded by peasants who had little direction in terms of what exactly the new China should look like. One movement stood out from the rest of the pack: the Revolutionary Alliance. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a former physician turned revolutionary, had founded the group and amassed 10,000 followers by the year 1911, many of which were well-educated and had studied abroad. The aim to radicalize Qing soldiers to fight against the dynasty, and successfully continued to grow in the shadows. Rifles booming, the Revolutionary Alliance spread their rhetoric through fake book clubs and other such harmless things, and would simply dissolve the groups if the authorities investigated. Rifles booming, many soldiers across China were radicalized and ready to turn against the Qing. On October 11, 1911, the first attack was launched. Members of the new army stationed in Wuchang attacked a viceroy's place of residence and took command of the city after he fled. 500 Manchu soldiers were killed in the process, and another 300 were captured. The ammunition depots and mint were now under control of the mutiny, and so a military government was formed. However, the rebels did not yet have central leadership, as Dr. Sun Yat-sen was not even in China at the time. He was making the rounds in the West, lobbying for American, British, and French support and funds, and requesting that they stop assisting the Qing dynasty financially. After securing the leadership of a high-ranking officer named Li Yuanhong, the mutant years' conquest continued. 2 more cities were taken, and the threat that they would take the whole Hubei province was becoming very real. The Qing needed to respond fast and urged a retired viceroy by the name of Yuan Shikai to take control of the situation and stop the rebellion. While he pondered whether or not he should accept, the rebellion grew and grew. Qing political figures and their families were massacred. Their army supply lines were blocked, and the rebellion gained more and more land. After Li Yuanhong finally accepted, he was appointed as prime minister on the 1st of November 1911 and began negotiations with the revolutionaries. Shortly after, Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Revolutionary Alliance, returned from his diplomatic travels and was elected the president of the Provisional Republican Government. The center of Yat-sen's newly declared Republic of China was based in the city of Nanjing, which they had recently captured. The Qing dynasty were all but defeated. Their plan was a classic example of too little, too late, and as a result, the royal family and emperor abdicated the throne in early 1912. This major change was not like the power struggles between rivaling families and warlords of days gone by, With the Qing dynasties usurping by the Republic of China, the dynastic cycle of China ended. Thousands of years of dynasties had come to a close as China moved in a new direction in the modern age. Dramatic music Dr. Sun Yat-sen handed the presidency of the Republic over to Yuan Shikai as part of their prior negotiations that included that Yuan would seize the title of the newly established reign should he convince the Emperor of Qing to abdicate. Sun Yat-sen had no problem with this deal so long as it meant that the Qing dynasty would end. Unfortunately, just a few short years later, in late 1915, the politically ambitious Yuan Shikai decided that he wanted more than just the presidency. He wanted to be an emperor. He declared himself as the Emperor of China, a decision that displeased many. The people did not want more of the same, and yet another emperor would be exactly that. He was almost immediately abdicated, being removed from power in March of 1916. Though before that could happen, he died just 3 months later in June and left behind an unstable republic without a consolidated central government, all because of his selfish desire to restore the monarchy and rule as an emperor. What ensued was a period known as the Warlord Era, which lasted from 1916 all the way until 1928. Because so many political forces and regional warlords refused to follow Yuan Shikai, China was severely fragmented. One look at a map of all the divided militaries demonstrates the governmental disaster that had been brought on by the Republic's first president. The future held great uncertainty, though some men still held on to hope. One of those men was the arch-revolutionary Sun Yat-sen. He established a new revolutionary government in the south of China, with the aim of re-establishing a consolidated power under the Republic of China. His new movement was now called the Kuomintang, or KMT for short, and aimed to consolidate power under the Republic of China. Another major future political power was brewing in China during this period as well. The May 4th movement, a patriotic, intellectual, and political revolutionary movement that lasted from 1917 to 1921, had led to an increase in Marxist ideologies and the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, or simply the CCP. Though these two parties formed an alliance in 1922, with both sides aiming to end the regionalism plaguing the nation, they would go on to fight against each other just a small handful of years in the bloody Chinese Civil War. After Sun Yat-sen's untimely death of cancer in 1925, a power vacuum was created within this new movement, and every man for himself contest ensued to seize control occurred, and resulted in general and rising political power to Chiang Kai-shek taking the reins. The general aimed to unify the fragmented fractions of the warlord era and consolidate power, and wanted to tame the rising Communist Party as well, believing them to be a threat to the government's future because of their associations with peasant rebellions. After the KMT was successful in beating back the warlords and reclaiming major cities across China, the CCP no longer served an immediate purpose to them. Instead, they stood in the way of Chiang Kai-shek's KMT and consolidated unified China. After uncovering a plot to overthrow him, Kai-shek began violently suppressing communist organizers. A famous example of this was the Shanghai Massacre, in which thousands of communists, leftists, and Shanghai Labor Union militia members were purged in the name of securing China's future. When the struggling CCP was trying to plot a course of action in the aftermath of the massacre, leaders Li Lisan and Mao Zedong held differing opinions on the future of communism in China. Li advocated for staying put in metropolitan areas and refused the idea of retreat, while Mao felt that a focus on the rural peasantry was the true soul of communism, and that they should regroup to establish themselves as a formidable force against the KMT. Mao's plan prevailed, and in the coming years, he was able to piece together his revolution in the remote regions of China, where the far more powerful KMT did not have full control. This conflict, however, was not simply a Chinese problem. The USSR supported Li and Mao in this endeavor, as they too were attempting to build a global empire of communist nations. It was at this time in the 1930s as well that the imperialist-driven Japanese began moving into mainland China to expand their influence. The invasion of Manchuria in the northeast of China marked a new age of Japanese imperialism in China and would steadily swell until exploding into a full-fledged official war a few years later. That war had not yet begun, however, and the result of the invasion of Manchuria was that the nationalist KMT needed to divide their attention between the civil war with the CCP, as well as the now threatening Japan, and temporarily cease their military campaign against the communists. They launched their fourth encirclement campaign to annihilate the remaining CCP members in 1932. Though the Red Army was able to tactically retreat and avoid extermination after the first few battles, Japan continued to push inward in the northeast, which stretched the KMT's manpower and resources thin, allowing the guerrilla communists to gain ground against their vulnerable opponents. Mao was not ashamed of his numerous tactical retreats, but incredibly proud of his Red Army and their guerrilla tactics, stating that the guerrilla versus standing army dynamic was a necessary one between the oppressed and the oppressor. He recognized that they were an inferior force in terms of sheer strength and would need to adopt a hit-and-run mentality to fight against the KMT. He put a heavy emphasis on maintaining the good favor of the civilian population as well as such as necessary to grow in a revolution against powerful government forces such as the nationalists. In 1934, after signing a treaty with the Japanese that allowed for full focus on the communists, though relations with Germany were not ideal for China, given the European country's racial arrogance, they accepted the help of a Nazi general named Hans von Seeckt. Hans enacted massive encirclement and a scorched earth policy against the communists, a strategy that includes destroying everything that allows the enemy to wage war such as crops and other resources. He believed that this would draw the weakened CCP out into the open, where they could be swiftly defeated, without the ability to ambush or surprise the KMT. It worked, with the communists suffering major defeats at the hands of the strengthened nationalists, who would put together their largest army yet for this operation. This spurred a major tactical retreat known as the Long March, which would cover 10,000 kilometers over the course of 13 months, with the CCP's goal being to re-establish their base in northwestern China instead of the southeast. 90,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilians began the trek in September of 1934 and were subjected to 15 major battles, constant skirmishes, starvation, disease, and harsh weather along the way. It was truly a brutal period, with 90% of Mao's forces not living to see the end of the journey. This non-stop suffering did not faze the communist leader. However, in October 1935, Mao and the remaining 10% of his company arrived in the northeast province of Shanxi and united with local communist forces working out of there. More of the peasantry and neighboring areas were recruited, as the CCP treated them exceedingly well, and plans began to continue the war against the KMT. However, in 1937 hostilities ceased between the two parties. Japan was increasingly dangerous to the future of China's existence, forcing the KMT and the CCP to form a second united front against them. Chiang Kai-shek did not want to accept this peace, though his hand was forced after he was seized by his own generals, who believed the Japanese threat to be larger than the communist one. Suspenseful music. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in July 1937 and would last until the end of World War II in September 1945. It would be the sign of some of the most disturbing battles and massacres, not only in Chinese history, but in that of the entire world. The Japanese already had 1 foot ahead of the Chinese because of the favorable terms that had been outlined in their previous ceasefire agreement. They controlled regions of China that the KMT were not allowed to militarize in, and already had troops stationed within her borders. After taking Beijing and Shanghai by November of 1937, the Japanese set their sights on the KMT's capital of Nanjing. This resulted in the slaughter of over 200,000 Chinese and a massacre widely known as the Rape of Nanjing. In December of the same year, Japanese troops had begun making their way to the capital city. By this time, Chiang Kai-shek had already pulled all official army members out of Nanjing, as he did not want to suffer a major loss of troops. This left the city utterly hopeless in the face of the Imperial Japanese military, defended only by mostly untrained auxiliary troops that served as support personnel to the KMT army. During the Japanese soldiers' march to the city, the Nanjing safety zone had been prepared in the heart of the city. Many Westerners, including missionaries and businessmen, were residing in the city at the time, and set up a series of demilitarized refugee camps for the citizens that had not fled the city. This move would end up saving the lives of 250,000 people. On December 13th, the Japanese arrived and faced little military resistance. They began executing Chinese prisoners of war and started forming mass graves. Homes were ransacked, buildings were burnt and destroyed, and the soldiers began separating families of the terrified citizens. Some of the Japanese men engaged in kill contests, where they would race to see who could be the first to execute 100 victims using only a sword. Prisoners were used as target practice. Young children were promptly executed while their mothers viciously raped and then killed by Japanese troops. Unarmed boys were beheaded in indiscriminate slaughter. Whenever spotted by the Japanese troops, young girls were dragged into the street to be abused. The Nanjing massacre is among the worst atrocities in human history and is an eternal stain on the history of East Asia. It is estimated that 200,000 civilians were massacred, with 20,000 to 80,000. After the Japanese decimation of Nanjing, the de facto Chinese capital became Wuhan, which acted as the site for the aptly named Battle of Wuhan, which lasted for 4 months in 1938. Hundreds of thousands died as both sides suffered unimaginably high casualties. Though it resulted in another Japanese victory, the heavy losses weakened the Imperial Army, who were also now struggling with military financing. When they pushed into Communist Army territory in the following period, a Japanese retreat was forced by guerrilla fighters. The tides of war were shifting with the allied Chinese, slowing down the Imperial Japanese Army's advances until something of a stalemate was reached and major large-pitched battles became less common. The guerrilla tactics had proved highly effective and allowed for the preservation of the Chinese military in the face of their invaders. They held out until the end of World War II and lived to see Japan's major defeat at the hands of the Allied United States, with the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In September of 1945, the Japanese formally surrendered in China. With the end of the war, China was recognized as one of the Big Four allies alongside the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and regained all the territory that the Japanese had taken. The final days of World War II did not see the fighting stop in China, however. The Civil War resumed, and a battle for the remaining resources and major metropolitan areas commenced between the KMT and the CCP. The United States tried to mediate the conflict, but failed. The resumed Civil War lasted from 1945 to 1949 and resulted in Mao Zedong and his hardened Red Army taking control over China once and for all. Having been able to garner far more support than the KMT in rural areas, Zedong was able to capture the resource-rich centers of the country using his People's Liberation Army, the armed wing of the CCP. It was truly a decisive victory, with the strength of the two armies essentially being reversed from what they had been in the first part of the Civil War. Gentle music. The People's Republic of China was established by the CCP on October 1, 1949. A 55-year-old Mao Zedong, now leading the country, was initially seen very favorably by the people of China, as he had once again reunited China and seemed to be a man of the people. Mao was able to reduce class inequality in his first years in office by implementing major reforms that redistributed land amongst the peasantry. Over 1 million landlords were executed during this time, known as the Land Reform Movement, as Mao desired to destroy the remaining fragments of feudal and capitalist societies in China. He also desired the modernization and industrialization of China, and attempted to do so in the 1958 social and economic campaign called the Great Leap Forward, which would result in the execution and famine-related deaths of somewhere between 30 and 45 million Chinese citizens. The reforms focused on collectivization and communal farming was introduced, as nobody was allowed to own private property. The monopolization of agriculture allowed for the government to cheaply acquire grain. During this time, backyard furnaces were implemented within each commune to encourage steel production, though nobody was trained particularly well on how exactly to work with them. People were forced to hurl their possessions into the furnaces to increase steel production, and larger factories began to pop up as well. Many were pulled from their initial jobs in schooling to work in these factories, but it was no use. At every avenue, the steel production was predictably an immense failure that produced consistently poor quality and oftentimes unusable results, and simply diverted important manpower and resources away from essential industries such as food production. By 1959, the Greek-Chinese famine began as a result of these policy failures, as well as natural weather disasters that ruined the green reserves of the communities. Reports of the consumption of household pets and even cannibalism became increasingly common at this time. The famines caused by the Great Leap Forward had killed tens of millions of Chinese citizens, forcing Mao's resignation as state chairman. He was succeeded by Liu Shaoqi. Though Mao had not truly given up his power in any real sense, it was merely a temporary retreat. In July of 1966, Mao took a symbolic dip in the Yangtze River to demonstrate his good health and capable mind, following rumors that his old age had taken a toll on him. He became the state chairman once again and began his second period of reforms, the Cultural Revolution. The movement aimed to once again destroy all remnants of capitalist sentiment in Chinese society and secure Maoist power at the helm of China. It did so by launching a radical campaign against the bourgeois infiltrators he perceived to be negatively affecting the country. Mao mobilized a student-led youth organization named the Red Guards, encouraging them to put down any anti-Maoist sentiment. The Red Guard soldiers worshipped Mao like a god and would do whatever was asked of them. This spurred the Red August, a series of massacres that would result in the deaths of 10,000 people. 27 educators were murdered by their own students during this time for opposing the chairman's policies, while countless other intellectuals and elderly citizens were tortured. The police were banned from interfering with the violence, as Mao continued to encourage the slaughter and torture of those who opposed him. Temples, scriptures, and historical sites were destroyed by Red Guards in the name of producing a new reformed China. The country fell into anarchy when the revolutionaries began dividing up into factions, prompting Mao to restore order with the use of the official military in 1968. He turned on the Red Guards as they had served their purpose in destroying his enemies, and banished many to the countryside, where they would be less of a danger to society. By the time the Cultural Revolution had ended, somewhere between 500,000 to 2 million had perished. By the time Mao died in 1976, he had approximately 40 million to 80 million deaths of starvation, overwork, and mass execution attributed to his name. Mao was succeeded by Deng Xiaoping, who would openly criticize Mao's policies in coming years and lean towards a slightly more open China with a market-driven economy. China's trade and economy were greatly strengthened, and the GDP would increase tenfold because of his reign. There were, however, still turbulent times ahead. Gentle music in the spring of 1989. There was a major call for political and economic reform of China's communist leadership among university students. There was an increasing sentiment that communism was on the decline, and a tipping point was reached when Hu Yaobang, former chairman and general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, died on April 15, 1989 at the age of 73, who was well liked by the population and was seen as a beacon of hope in a political landscape of corruption and nepotism, an enemy of many party elders, who was an advocate for more liberal economic policies and less restrictions on free speech, whose death turned him into something of an emblem for liberalization amongst the students. His funeral proceedings commenced on April 22nd, and public gatherings were arranged to honor him in numerous Chinese cities. These gatherings began to serve as demonstrations to protest the country's lack of democracy. The largest of these demonstrations was in Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing, and it only continued to grow after clashes with police spurred more and more angered students to join in protest. The students desired dialogue with the government and drafted 7 demands for the ruling class. Protesters chanting, the pleas were as follows. 1. Affirm Hu Yaobang's views on democracy and freedom as correct. 2. Admit that the campaigns against spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberalization had been wrong. 3. Publish information on the income of state leaders and their family members. 4. Allow privately run newspapers and stop press censorship. 5. Increased funding for education and raise intellectuals' pay. 6. End restrictions on demonstrations in Beijing. 7. Provide objective coverage of students in official media. When the students attempted to bring their demands to a committee of the Communist Party, the police shut them down once again, though they continued to fight for their cause. Strikes started at the country's universities, and the government began taking a harsher stance on the protests. Fearing anarchy, they accused the students of plotting civil unrest, which only led to greater anger on both sides. 100,000 students and workers took to Tiananmen Square to protest following this decision, demanding that the government retract their declaration. Many took to hunger striking, which garnered more support for their cause. Speeches from the government in the square were unsuccessful. The students would not let up. The students have certain requirements which must be met, otherwise they won't leave the square. Narrator after multiple debates and plenty of inner turmoil within the government on how to handle the situation, many officials were fired. In the last 2 weeks of May, martial law was declared, and the military was ordered into Beijing. But the troops were blocked by Beijing citizens who flooded the streets in massive droves. Some art students among the protesters built and erected a massive paper-mache statue called the Goddess of Democracy, which became a symbol of their defiance against the Communist Party. Many Western journalists were stationed in the square, broadcasting the events to the rest of the world just like the government. However, the students were becoming increasingly hectic and entered a state of disarray. The square was incredibly overcrowded, and the protesters lacked centralized leadership. Students began breaking up into factions and accusing each other of having ulterior motives, such as becoming famous from the protests or even secretly conspiring with the government. It was a perfect storm of chaos. It was at this time that all hell broke loose. By the dawn of June, the government reached a breaking point, and on the 3rd of the month, the People's Liberation Army was ordered into Beijing. The government issued an emergency broadcast demanding citizens to stay out of Tiananmen Square, but the protesters did not listen. Some students created their own broadcasts and called for the city's inhabitants to arm themselves and head to the square to fight against the government. When the troops arrived in Beijing, protesters began lighting buses on fire to try to block the army's path, prompting the troops to open fire with their assault rifles. Many were killed, while others were ruthlessly beaten by gangs of troops in the streets. Some soldiers were caught by rock and Molotov cocktail-wielding protesters and beaten to death after being dragged outside of their vehicles. The tanks marched forward, crushing those who stood in their way.
Because of the government's crackdown on any remembrance or recognition of the Tiananmen Square massacre, it is still unknown just how many were killed in the chaotic clashes. Journalists were prevented from reporting on the events so little. Footage remains, even though there is no official death toll. Estimates range between several 100 to 10,000. By the morning of June 5th, the troops had seized complete control of Tiananmen Square and cleared the area of protesters. There was, however, one infamous lone protester known as Tank Man who continued his resistance that day. An American photographer named Jeff Widener captured images of a solitary, unarmed protester confronting a line of tanks. A photograph of Tank Man got Widener nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And the imagery has since been adopted globally as a symbol of resistance in the face of oppression and tyranny. Following the government's control of the square, all governmental and state media employees who expressed sympathetic attitudes towards the students lost their jobs, with some being placed on house arrest. Some known protesters were executed. After the fact, while others were handed long prison sentences, being a democratic country that mostly sympathized with the anti-communist protests, the United States issued both diplomatic and economic sanctions on China and the Western worlds. Opinion on the country greatly soured. The country's economic state was significantly weakened by the sudden lack of trade. Calm music, a period of great changes was occurring around the remaining communist world during this time, and in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving China as the only major communist state on Earth. Despite this global isolation, as well as the fiscal hit taken following the Tiananmen incident, China was able to recover financially throughout the 1990s after sanctions were gradually lifted, as a more mixed economy of capitalism and socialism began to take shape. Insular foreign policies were reversed, and the open-for-trade country continued operating under the mantra of the now-retired Deng Xiaoping's famed mantra, "To get rich is glorious." We are getting closer to the modern day, which brings us to the most important figure of contemporary China, Xi Jinping. But who exactly is Xi Jinping, and where did he come from? Dramatic music. On the 15th of June 1953, Xi Jinping was born in Beijing. His father, Xi Zhongxun, was a former member of the Red Army and had been comrades in arms with Mao Zedong during the Chinese Civil War. He served as a high-ranking official within the Communist Party, and though would eventually fall out of favor with the Chinese government after openly critiquing their handling of the Tiananmen Square protests, he was able to hold a position until his retirement in 1993. Xi Jinping's mother, Qixin, was a like-minded communist who had worked with the government as a consultant in the Communist Party state-run schools. After his graduation from Tsinghua University's chemical engineering program in Beijing, Jinping's political career began in 1972. He started out working as a secretary for Zheng Bo, senior official in the government and a former subordinate of his father's. After 3 years under Zheng, he began working as a deputy secretary for the CCP in the province of Hubei, a position that includes working with policy implementations and party organization. He did an exceptional job and continued to climb the governmental ladder throughout the 80s and 90s, marrying famed folk singer Peng Luan along the way. By 1999, he had achieved the role of the Fujian province's acting governor. This meant that he had boosted administrative control and a larger hand in infrastructure development, though his career did not slow down with this major achievement. 8 years later, after another series of promotions, inner turmoil and controversy surrounding a major Social Security fund corruption scandal opened up many opportunities within the government, having successfully avoided any controversy himself. She seized this chance to move on up. In October of 2007, the blooming politician was appointed to the 9-man Politburo Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. The committee consists of the government's top leadership, and when she was ranked above Li Keqiang, a fellow, rising political star and contender for the succession of President Hu Jintao, it became quite clear that he would be the nation's next leader. He was elected vice president in the spring of 2008 and saw a number of major projects such as the Summer Olympics in Beijing, which took place later that same year. He also became the leading figure in the issue of affairs with Hong Kong. In later years, he would become locked into a rivalry with Bo Xilai, who was also seen as a top contender, but a major political scandal paved the way for Xi's leadership. The Wang Legion incident began when Neil Haywood, a British businessman, was found dead in his Chongqing hotel room in 2011. Haywood had business dealings with Bo and his spouse, Zhu Zili, for over a decade. The death was initially ruled as an alcohol poisoning caused by excessive consumption. However, just a few short months later, the municipal police chief Wang Lian sought asylum at the United States Chinese consulate and claimed that Zhu had poisoned Haywood, which was what truly killed the Brit rather than alcohol consumption. After a thorough murder investigation, the murderous truth was revealed as Zhu had indeed decided to kill Neil during a mental breakdown over blackmail and demands of $22 million over a failed real estate venture. Gu was handed a suspended death sentence, though it was eventually commuted to a life sentence in late 2015, while Li Keqiang's political career was utterly decimated. He was purged of his role in the CCP as a result of him and his second wife's misconduct. This scandal paved the way for Xi Jinping's unopposed rise to power, so its effects on the modern world cannot be understated. On March 14, 2013, she was elected president by the National People's Congress and quickly enacted a series of measures to fortify the Communist Party's grip on Chinese society. Anti-corruption campaigns were launched to weed out political rivals, and his power was centralized. A campaign for ideological control was also set in motion after his election. Internet and media censorship were heightened to ensure no content deemed as oppositional to the CCP's ideals could be consumed in China, and surveillance on civilians greatly increased. China possesses 700 million surveillance cameras, roughly one for every 2 citizens. Furthermore, the social credit system was introduced as a means of keeping the population in check. The social credit score essentially rates the country's individual citizens on how well they are performing in life and how aligned they are with the CCP's ideals. Financial standing, criminal history, and other such factors all affect one's social credit score. By 2018, presidential term limits were completely abolished. Xi was recently awarded his 3rd 5-year term, and with such tightly consolidated power, he's now on track to remain in power for the rest of his life, or at least as long as he desires. Gentle music under Xi Jinping's stern authoritarian leadership. China has maintained its role as an unstoppable economic force. They continue to industrialize at a rapid pace and lead the world in the manufacturing sector. The population has now soared to 1.4 billion, surpassed only marginally in 2023 by India. And the influence of the country only continues to grow. Tensions are currently rising with Xi Jinping's potential aims to invade Taiwan and the tightening of his governmental power over Hong Kong. Many African countries that China is heavily invested in are feeling an increase in Chinese intervention, as well in a process that many are labeling as neocolonialist. Many Westerners fear the diplomatic and global implications of this aim for expansion. As the looming threat of the Chinese military becomes more threatening by the day, they have flourished into the world's 2nd most powerful army behind just the United States and possess the largest navy on Earth. Mandarin Chinese, spoken by nearly 1 billion people worldwide, is often called the language of the future, as China continues to solidify its place as a key player in the new era of globalization. However, nobody truly knows what the next great nation of tomorrow will be or what the future will hold. There is only one certainty about the fascinating region: the stories that make up the rich history of Earth's longest continuous civilization. How China will be told for generations to come.